Hey there, and welcome back. Take a deep breath, because tonight's evening is for the part of you that wants to be transported, the part that has been wondering lately what it would feel like to walk through a city 600 years gone, in the long blue dusk of a single ordinary day when the cathedral bell is ringing for vespers and the streets are slowly emptying and the watchmen are beginning their rounds at the gates. If that is the part of you that has come to this script tonight, you are in the right place. Let me take you to medieval York on the evening of Corpus Christi in the year 1380. Let me walk you through it, bit by bit, from the last hour of the long northern daylight to the closing of the gates and the calling of the watch, in the unhurried way that we do these evenings. Ready? Close your eyes and let your mind drift back 646 years to a Thursday in late May, when the second city of England is winding down from the longest holy day of its year. Picture a walled city set on a long ridge above the River Ouse, with a Gothic cathedral rising from its centre against the evening sky. Imagine the smell of cooking fires from 1,000 household hearths, drifting through the streets in the still air. Wherever you are listening from tonight, leave it in the comments below. Every place that comes in is one more dot on the imagined map of who has come to this evening with us. And York in 1380 was a city where one met, in the course of any ordinary day, people who had come from every corner of England and from much of Europe besides. If you have not yet subscribed, please do. Every subscriber helps the channel grow, and there are many more nights like this one waiting for us. Tonight, we are going to walk through medieval York on the most important day of its year, in the long quiet hour after the festival has ended and the city is settling into its evening. The destination matters. York in 1380 is the second city of England, after London, and one of the great cities of northern Europe. Its population is somewhere between 10 and 15,000 souls, which by modern standards is the size of a market town, but which in the late 14th century makes it a significant urban centre, 3 or 4 times the size of any other northern English town, and the seat of the Archbishop, who is the second most powerful churchman in England after Canterbury. The city sits on the ridge between two rivers, the Ouse to the southwest and the Foss to the east, with the great cathedral church of St. Peter rising from the highest point of the ridge in the elaborate decorated Gothic style of the early 14th century. The new tower over the central crossing, not yet complete, but the great east end with its vast traceried windows already in its present form for the past 60 years. The city is walled. The walls, in their present form, are the walls of the 13th century, with 4 principal gates: Micklegate Bar, Bootham Bar, Monk Bar, and Walngate Bar, controlling the 4 main roads into the city, and a perimeter of about 2 miles enclosing the dense urban centre. Inside the walls are perhaps 40 parish churches, a dozen religious houses, the Archbishop's Palace, the Merchant Guildhall, and the dense weave of streets and snickelways and inhabited closes that constitute the working urban fabric of the place. Outside the walls are the suburbs, the leper hospital, the gallows, the smaller religious houses, the fields and orchards of the cathedral chapter, and the Abbey of St. Mary.
The whole arrangement is one of the most impressive urban settings in 14th century England, and tonight we are going inside it.
We will travel into the city the way any visitor on this evening would travel on foot, through Micklegate Bar, the principal southern gate of the city, which has stood in its present form since the late 13th century, and which is the gate through which kings and archbishops and royal commissioners have made their formal entries into York for the past 100 years. The road from the south runs up to the gate over the open field outside the walls, past the leper hospital and past the gibbet on its low mound, and through the great stone arch of the bar itself, where the gatekeeper sits on his stool with his pike across his knees, observing the late traffic in and out as the day winds down. We will pass under the arch with the late stream of pilgrims and traders and country people returning from the mystery plays, who have spent the day at the stations along the play route and who are now making their slow way home in the long northern daylight. We will come out on the other side onto Micklegate itself, the long street that runs northeast from the bar down the ridge toward the Ouse Bridge, and we will walk down it with the dispersing crowd in the warm late light of a May evening, with the bells of the parish churches beginning to ring for vespers and the city laid out ahead of us in the gold of the westering sun. Who we will encounter tonight is the working population of medieval York at the evening hour. Not the famous figures, of whom there are not many at this date that you would recognize by name, but the trades and offices and conditions of life that filled the city streets at the close of any ordinary day. We will pass the butchers of the shambles closing up their stalls in the narrow trade street they have occupied for the past 2 centuries. We will pass the wool merchants at their warehouses on the Ouse, finishing the accounts of the day. We will pass the vicar's choral of the Minster gathering in the late afternoon for the office of vespers. We will pass the watermen at the Ouse Bridge unloading the last barges of the day. We will pass the players and the pageant masters of the guilds, putting away the wagons and costumes of the mystery cycle that has just ended at its 48th and final station. We will pass the pilgrims to the shrine of St. William of York in the Minster, who have come from all over the north of England for the festival, and who are settling for the night in the inns and the religious houses and the hospitality of the parish congregations. We will be among these people in the way that a careful traveller is among the people of a foreign city, close enough to see the faces, present enough to hear the talk, but not so close that we change anything by being there. The evening of medieval York on Corpus Christi 1380 will pass around us in the way that an evening passes in any inhabited city, with the working population doing the work of the closing day, and we will walk through it from the south gate to the Minster to the river to the walls in the long blue hour between the festival and the night. Settle in. The May evening is at its broadest hour. The light is gold on the limestone of Micklegate Bar. The gatekeeper has nodded us through. The crowd is loose around us, dispersing slowly toward the parish churches and the taverns and the houses of the city. The bells are beginning to ring. The cathedral rises ahead of us at the top of the ridge against the late sky. Let us go in. York in the year 1380 is a city in the middle of its long medieval afternoon. The great wave of wealth that built the cathedral and the city walls and the parish churches has crested and is beginning, very slowly, to recede. The Black Death of 1349 swept through here, as it swept through every English town, and the recovery of the population over the 30 years since has been partial. The city is perhaps 15% smaller than it was on the eve of the plague. The wool trade, which had been the great engine of the northern English economy for the past 2 centuries, is beginning the long, slow shift that will see the centre of the trade move from the wool export economy of the late 13th century to the cloth export economy of the late 15th. And York in 1380 is at the awkward middle stage where the older trade is still dominant, but the newer is beginning to assemble. The political weather of England is uncertain. Richard II is on the throne, a boy of 13, with his uncles in regency around him and the great lords of the realm jostling for influence over the boy king. The war with France, which began under his grandfather Edward III in 1337, is still going on at low intensity along the Channel coast, with the great victories of Crécy and Poitiers 30 years in the past, and the long unsuccessful slog of the late 14th century well underway. The peasants' revolt, which will sweep through southern England and reach the gates of London in June of next year, is a thing the people of York in May 1380 do not yet know is coming. But the social pressures that will produce it, the poll taxes, the wage controls, The resentment of the labouring classes against the lords and the clergy who hold them in place are already at work, and one can hear, if one listens, the first faint rumblings of the trouble in the talk of the alehouses and the markets. The city itself is the principal urban settlement of the north of England. London is larger, perhaps 40,000 souls to York's 15, but London is far away, and the cities and towns between London and Scotland are all much smaller than York. The next largest town in the north is Beverley, perhaps 8 miles distant, at about half York's size. Newcastle and Carlisle and Durham are smaller again. The whole of the north of England, from the Humber to the Tweed, looks to York as its natural urban capital, and the people one meets in the streets of York on any ordinary day are people who have come from 100-mile radius of the city. Yorkshire farmers in for the market, Lancashire weavers selling their cloth, Cumberland shepherds with fleeces for the wool staple, Northumbrian miners with iron and lead from the dales, Lincolnshire pilgrims on the road to the shrine of St. William, and the steady traffic of the Archbishop's officials and the King's commissioners moving in and out of the city on the daily business of the great institutions for which York is the northern headquarters. The streets are busy in a way that smaller towns are not. The wealth is visible in a way that smaller towns do not have to offer. The city is one of the principal sights of 14th-century England, and the visitors who come to it for the first time, pilgrims, country gentlemen, foreign merchants, record, in the few documents that survive from the period, the impression that we would expect them to record of a city that is more substantial, more sophisticated, more crowded, and more grand than they had been prepared for by the lesser northern towns through which they had been travelling. The single building that dominates the city is the Cathedral Church of St. Peter the Minster, as it is called in the local speech, in the old Anglo-Saxon word for a monastery church that has been retained in the language of York for the past 700 years. The minster sits at the highest point of the ridge, with its great east window facing over the city toward the rising sun, and its central tower still under construction in 1380. The upper stages not to be completed for another 25 years, rising above every other building in the city by a considerable margin. The cathedral is one of the great Gothic churches of England, comparable in scale to Canterbury and Westminster, and it is, by the standards of the late 14th century, the most ambitious architectural project being conducted anywhere in the north of England. The nave is the great work of the early 14th century, completed by the masons of the decorated Gothic school in the 1330s, with its high vault and its slender columns and its blind tracery along the triforium. The choir is being rebuilt in the new perpendicular Gothic style over the years 1361 to 1405. The works are now 20 years into their 44-year programme, and the visitor who comes to York in 1380 sees the new East End already complete, and the central section of the choir still partly enclosed by the timber screens of the mason's lodge. The east window itself, the great glazed wall of stained glass that John Thornton of Coventry will execute in the early years of the 15th century, is not yet in place. What occupies the east end of the choir tonight is the temporary timber and glass arrangement that the chapter has put up to keep out the weather while the building works continue. The minster, in 1380, is therefore a building in mid-transformation, with the older parts in their finished medieval glory and the newer parts still at the rough stage of construction. The whole assemblage rising above the city as the principal visual fact of York for the past 3 centuries and for the 7 centuries that are to follow. Around the minster cluster the buildings of the cathedral, close the Archbishop's palace, the deanery, the residences of the canons, and the vicar's choral. The chapter house with its remarkable octagonal vault, the school of the songboys, the library, the various administrative offices of the diocese. The whole close is enclosed by its own wall, with its own gates, separating it from the secular city around it, and the inhabitants of the close, perhaps 200 clergy, choristers, servants, and dependents, live their lives largely within its enclosure, governed by the chapter and answerable to the archbishop in the parallel social world that English cathedral closes have constituted for the past 1,000 years. Outside the cathedral close, the secular city occupies the rest of the walled enclosure. The principal streets, Micklegate from the South Gate, Coney Street from the River Bridge, Stonegate from the Minster down to Lendal, Petergate running east from the cathedral, the shambles and the pavement at the commercial heart form a rough network over the ridge, with the smaller streets and snickleways filling in the gaps in the way that medieval cities filled in their gaps, with no overall plan, but with the dense organic logic that long-inhabited urban places develop over the centuries. Within this network are the parish churches, 40 of them, almost one for every 250 souls, each with its own parish boundaries and its own incumbent and its own dedicated quarter of the city. Some of these churches are substantial buildings of considerable architectural interest. All Saints' Pavement, at the commercial heart of the city, is one of the principal merchant churches, paid for by the guilds and adorned with their banners. Sconty Michael Spurriergate, by the bridge, is the parish church of the saddlers and spurriers and the metal workers of Spurriergate. Holy Trinity, Goodramgate, in its quiet close, is the parish church of one of the older quarters. In Castlegate, near the castle on the river, is among the more ancient foundations, with parts of its fabric dating from before the Norman conquest. Each of these churches is a working institution, with its parish life, its weekly services, its parish accounts, its parish poor relief, its parish guilds, and its place in the daily round of urban worship that constitutes the principal devotional fabric of the medieval city. Beyond the parish churches are the religious houses. The great Benedictine Abbey of St. Mary lies just outside the city wall to the west. With its enclosed precinct and its great church and its monastic community of perhaps 50 brethren, one of the wealthiest religious houses of the north of England. The Augustinian Priory of Holy Trinity, the Franciscan Friary, the Dominican Friary, the Carmelite Friary, the Augustinian Friary, each occupies its own precinct within or just outside the walls, with its own community of regulars conducting its own daily round of offices and study and pastoral work. There are also the Hospital St. Leonard's, the great medieval hospital of York, with its perhaps 200 beds for the sick and indigent, run by its own community of religious brethren and lay sisters. St. Mary's in the Horse Fair, a smaller foundation, the Lezer House outside the walls for the lepers, and a handful of smaller almshouses and chantry chapels with hospitable function. The religious houses taken together contain perhaps 400 or 500 persons in formal vows of religion, and they constitute one of the principal employer institutions of the city, alongside the cathedral chapter and the secular trade guilds. The economy of the city is the economy of a major medieval commercial centre. The wool trade dominates. York is one of the staple towns of England, one of the designated centres through which the wool of the surrounding counties must be brought for export to the Low Countries, and the wool merchants of the city are among the wealthiest men in northern England. The wool warehouses along the Ouse, just below the bridge, hold the season's clip of perhaps 100,000 fleeces awaiting shipment down river to Hull and onward to Bruges and Ghent and the great cloth towns of Flanders. The cloth trade is beginning to grow alongside the wool trade. The weavers and fullers and dyers of York are increasingly turning the wool into finished cloth before export, in the pattern that will, over the 15th century, gradually shift the English economy from the wool export model to the cloth export model. The other trades of the city are the trades that any major medieval commercial centre supports. The butchers of the shambles, the bakers, the brewers, the cordwainers, the saddlers, the smiths, the carpenters, the masons, the glaziers, the goldsmiths, the spicers, the apothecaries, the scriveners, the lawyers, the notaries. Each trade is organised into its own craft guild, with its own ordinances and officers and patron saint and parish church, and place in the procession of the Corpus Christi plays. The guild structure is the principal economic and social framework of the working population, and the year of any tradesman in York in 1380 is organised by the rhythm of his guild's calendar as much as by the agricultural year of the surrounding country. The day we have come to share with York is Corpus Christi, the great medieval feast of the body of Christ, celebrated on the Thursday after Trinity Sunday, which in the year 1380 falls on the 24th of May. The feast was instituted by Pope Urban IV in 1264 and was extended to the Universal Church in 1311, and the celebration of it in northern English cities developed during the 14th century into one of the great civic festivals of the medieval year. In York, as in Chester and Wakefield and a handful of other northern towns, the day is marked by the performance of a cycle of religious plays written in the local vernacular and performed by the trade guilds of the city in the streets along a fixed processional route. The York cycle, which has been performed annually for perhaps the past 40 years, and which will continue to be performed annually for another 150 until the Reformation suppresses it in the 1560s, consists of 48 individual pageants, short plays of perhaps 10 or 15 minutes each, telling in sequence the entire Christian story from the creation of the world through the fall of Lucifer, the Garden of Eden, the flood, the prophets and patriarchs, the Annunciation and Nativity, the ministry of Christ, the Passion, the Resurrection, the Ascension, and concluding with the Last Judgment. Each pageant is sponsored, financed, and performed by a particular trade guild. The shipwrights play the building of Noah's Ark, the bakers play the Last Supper, the butchers play the Crucifixion, the saddlers play the harrowing of hell, and so on through the cycle, with the guild's craft connections sometimes determining their pageant, or titre de pageant, sometimes purely arbitrary, the goldsmiths and the adoration of the Magi. The pageants are performed on wagons-wheeled stages, built and maintained by the guilds which process through the city along a fixed route, stopping at each of the 12 designated stations to perform the play. The first wagon sets out from the first station at first light, performs the first pageant, then proceeds to the second station, while the second wagon performs at the first station, and so on in the staggered procession that allows all 12 stations to see all 48 pageants over the course of the day. The first station begins at 4 in the morning. The last station finishes after 9 at night. The entire day is given over to the cycle, with the city's working life suspended for the festival and the population of York and its visitors moving from station to station to see the pageants performed. What we have just come into the city at the end of is the long late afternoon and the evening winding down of this day. The last performances are happening now at the final stations along the route. The wagons at the earlier stations have already been wheeled away and are being returned to the guild halls where they live throughout the year. The players in their costumes, Adam in his loincloth, Noah with his white beard, Pilate in his Roman robes, the devil in his mask, are coming off the wagons and changing back into their working clothes in the back rooms of the guild halls. The audiences who have followed the pageants from station to station, accumulating the full story over the long northern day, are dispersing slowly through the streets of the city, talking about what they have seen, finding their way to the inns and the taverns and the religious houses where they will spend the night. The great festival of the city is in its closing hour, and the long evening calm is beginning to settle over the streets as the population draws back from the public spectacle into the private hours of supper and rest. This is the moment at which we have entered the city. The late afternoon, the dispersing crowd, the wagons being wheeled away, the bells beginning for vespers, the light on the limestone of the gate behind us, gold and warm, the minster ahead of us at the top of the ridge, the central tower under its timber scaffolding, the great East End catching the last of the sun. Let us walk into the city now, slowly in the unhurried way that we are going to do this evening, and let us see what is happening as the city moves from its longest day toward its quieter night. We come up Micklegate, the long principal street that runs from the south gate down the ridge toward the Ouse Bridge. The street is paved with the local limestone setts, worn smooth by perhaps 2 centuries of use, with a central gutter running down the middle for the wastewater of the houses on either side. The street is broad by medieval standards, perhaps 20 feet from house front to house front, but the upper stories of the timber-framed houses overhang the street by 4 or 5 feet on each side, so that the visual experience of walking down Micklegate is of moving through a kind of leaning canyon, with the strip of evening sky narrow above the projecting jetties and the street darker below than the open courtyards beyond it. The houses on either side are the substantial dwellings of the merchant class, 3 and 4 stories high, timber framed with infill of wattle and daub or of stone, with ground floor shops facing the street and the family quarters above. The shops are mostly shut at this hour, the shutters down and the goods withdrawn, with the shopkeepers either upstairs at their suppers or at the alehouses around the corner, or still talking with neighbours in the doorways about the pageants of the day. The smell of the street is the composite smell of a medieval city at the end of a long day. Wood smoke from 1,000 household fires, the sour note of the open drains, the faint sweetness of the dung heaps at the back of the houses, the sharper smell of horse dung in the street, where the gentry have ridden past during the day, the rich smell of cooking from the kitchens behind the houses where the evening meals are being prepared, and underneath all of it, the deeper note of an inhabited place. The smell that medieval cities had, that no modern city quite has any more, of stone and timber and animal life, and smoke and incense and human living, all mixed together in the warm air of a May evening. We pass Holy Trinity Priory on our left, with its enclosed precinct behind a stone wall, its small church visible above the wall, and the iron gate at its entrance, now closed for the day. We pass the row of merchant houses below the priory, with the gilded signs of the trades hanging above the closed shop fronts. A glove for the glover, a saddle for the saddler, a pair of scissors for the tailor, an apothecary's pestle and mortar for the apothecary. We pass the parish church of St. Martin cum Gregory, the parish church for the upper Micklegate residents, with its low Norman tower and its later medieval nave and its enclosed churchyard. The bell of St. Martin's is ringing now for vespers, the single bell in the tower being pulled by the parish clerk in the steady rhythm that has called this parish to its evening office for the past 200 years. The crowd around us is the dispersing crowd of the festival. There are country people in their working clothes who have come in for the day labourers in coarse wool tunics and rough leather shoes, women in plain wool gowns with the long headcloths of the working class, children running underfoot. There are pilgrims with the scallop shell badge of Compostela, or the leaden ampoule of Canterbury, or the small lead figurine of St. William of York, pinned to their cloaks, marking the shrine they have come to honour. There are tradesmen from the smaller towns of Yorkshire, Beverley, Selby, Tadcaster, Ripon, who have come in for the festival and who are returning to their lodgings or to their carts at the city's inns. There are clergy parish priests from the surrounding villages who have come in to see the pageants, friars on their begging rounds, the vicars choral of the minster on their way back to the close for vespers, moving through the crowd in their habits and gowns. There are local citizens, the substantial merchants of York, with their wives and children, walking back from the stations toward their houses in the better streets, dressed in the party-coloured wool gowns and the fur-trimmed hoods of the urban gentry. The whole crowd is dispersing in the slow, unhurried way that festival crowds disperse, with conversation and recognition and the calling of greetings from one group to another, and the dogs running underfoot, and the children pulling at their mothers' hands, and the late afternoon light slanting down between the leaning houses onto the stone sets of the street. Halfway down Micklegate, we come to the open space, where the second station of the play cycle has been set up, a wider place in the street, with a permanent stone marker on the wall of the house at one corner that indicates the station's position. The wagon of the last pageant to be performed here has just been wheeled away, but the timber benches that were set up around the station yesterday for the audience are still in place, and a knot of the audience is still standing about, talking over what they have seen, in the way that audiences linger after a long performance. We pause for a moment. We listen. What they are talking about mostly is the crucifixion play, the pageant of the Butchers' Guild, which is by tradition one of the most striking and most discussed pageants of the cycle. The play, as performed in the York cycle, presents the crucifixion of Christ in the form of a detailed dramatic action, with the four executioners, Roman soldiers in the dramatic logic, but represented on the wagon by four butchers of the guild in their working aprons, nailing the figure of Christ to the cross in a sequence of carefully choreographed actions, with each soldier in turn declaring his particular act and the resistance of the wood and the pain of the victim being represented through the dialogue rather than through any actual physical suffering. The text of the play, which survives in the manuscript register of the city, is one of the masterpieces of late medieval English dramatic writing, restrained, theological, and at the same time of considerable emotional intensity, presenting the central act of the Christian story in the working idiom of the city's labouring classes. The audience around the station has, by the evidence of the talk, been moved by it. One old woman with the scallop shell badge of a pilgrim is wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand. A group of younger tradesmen is arguing in the technical way that medieval audiences argued about plays, whether the actor who played the figure of Christ this year was as good as the actor who played the role last year, and whether the timing of the cross-raising at the climax was managed as effectively as it had been 3 years ago, when one of the elder butchers had played the master executioner. These are the conversations of a community that knows its annual play cycle intimately and that takes it seriously as a religious and aesthetic event. We listen for a few minutes. We walk on. Further down Micklegate, the crowd thins. We come to the bottom of the ridge where Micklegate runs into Ouse Bridge, the great stone bridge over the river that connects the south side of the city to the north side. The bridge is one of the wonders of medieval York, a stone bridge of 5 arches, built in the late 12th century and rebuilt in the late 13th, carrying the principal road over the river and lined on both sides with the houses and shops of the bridge community. The bridge is, in effect, its own street, a length of timber-framed houses standing on the stone piers above the water, with shops on the ground floor and dwellings above, and a covered chapel of St. William on a pier at the centre, where Mass is said daily for the souls of those who have died in the river and for the safety of those crossing it. The bridge is one of the busiest streets of the city in any ordinary hour, and even at this evening hour it is full of traffic, the last carts of the day rolling across with goods for the morning markets. the foot traffic of the dispersing festival crowd, the bridge's own residents at their doorways watching the world go by. We pause on the bridge for a moment. We look up the river to our left, toward the northwest, where the great walled precinct of St. Mary's Abbey rises beyond the city wall, its abbey church catching the late light. We look down the river to our right, toward the southeast, where the wool warehouses and the merchant quays line the bank, with the great wool wharf below the bridge where the bales are weighed for export. We look down at the river itself, brown and slow with the spring waters, with a few late barges still working their way upstream to the wharves above the bridge. The Ouse is the principal commercial artery of York, the river by which the city connects to Hull at its mouth and through Hull to the wider world of the North Sea trade, and the river traffic of an ordinary working day brings in the goods that fill the city's shops and carries out the goods that fund the city's wealth. We watch the river for a moment. Then we cross on the north side of the bridge. We come into the heart of the commercial city. The street here is called Ousegate, as it rises away from the bridge, then becomes pavement at the open trading place beyond it, then becomes High Ousegate as it continues east toward the pavement market cross. This whole area, the wedge of streets between the bridge and the pavement, is the trading heart of York. The substantial merchant houses of the great wool families line the street on either side, 3 and 4 stories high, with elaborate timber facades and projecting jetties, and the painted signs of the trades hanging from iron brackets above the closed shop fronts. The houses here are among the grandest in the city. The merchant who lives in one of them is one of perhaps 50 men in York who have the financial standing to be addressed as master and who can afford the wool gown with the fur-trimmed hood that marks a member of the merchant aristocracy of the city. These are the men who run the city, who serve as bailiffs and chamberlains and aldermen, and at the head of the city government as mayor, and the houses they live in are the visible expression of their standing in the urban hierarchy. We turn left off pavement into a narrower street that runs north for a few hundred yards into the older heart of the city. This is the Shambles, the Butcher's Street of medieval York, one of the oldest continuously occupied trading streets in the city, occupied by the Butchers' Guild for the past 2.5 centuries, and named for the shelves and racks on which the meat of the day's slaughter was displayed for sale. The street is narrow, perhaps 10 or 12 feet wide at the broadest point, and the timber-framed houses on either side overhang it so far that the projecting upper stories almost touch above the centre of the street, with only a strip of sky perhaps 3 feet wide visible between them. The street is one of the narrowest in the city, and at this evening hour, with the day's trade over and the butchers shuttering their stalls, it has the close, confined quality that medieval trade streets had when their working day was ending and the upper stories were closing in for the night. The smell of the Shambles is the smell that this street has had for the past 200 years, and that it will continue to have for another 150. It is the smell of fresh blood, washed down with water from the channel that runs along the centre of the street, mixed with the smell of the sawdust on the stall fronts, where the meat has been laid out during the day, mixed with the smell of the offal tubs at the back of each shop, mixed with the smell of the dogs who have been hanging about the doorways all day waiting for scraps, mixed with the smell of the river water that flows down the centre channel from the standpipe at the top of the street, and underneath all of it, the deeper note of decades of butchery laid into the stone foundations of the houses themselves. The smell, for a modern visitor, would be overwhelming. For the inhabitants of the Shambles, who have lived above their shops for generations, it is simply the smell of their street, no more remarkable than the smell of bread for the bakers in the parallel street, 1 block over. The butchers themselves are at their evening work, washing down the stalls with buckets of water from the channel, putting away the chopping blocks, packing the unsold cuts into the cold larders at the back of the shops, where the day's meat will be kept overnight, against tomorrow's sale, sweeping the bone fragments and the gristle into the offal tubs that the bone collectors will empty at dawn. They are dressed in their working aprons, long, heavy leather aprons, stained dark with the blood of the day, worn over wool tunics that have absorbed the same staining over the years until the tunics themselves are dark to the elbow. Their arms are bare to the elbow and red with the work of the day. Their hands carry the steady scars of butchery, the small nicks over the fingers, the longer marks over the palms, the calluses where the cleaver has been held 1,000 times. They are large, strong men, mostly with the build that a lifetime of heavy lifting and constant standing produces, and they move about their stalls with the slow, steady efficiency of men who have done this work since they were apprentices of 12, and who have inherited the trade from their fathers and grandfathers before them. The Butchers' Guild of York is one of the oldest and one of the most powerful of the city's craft guilds. It traces its formal organisation to the early 13th century and its informal existence to a generation or two earlier than that. The guild controls the entire meat trade of the city. No man can sell meat in York without being a member of the guild, and the guild's officers regulate the prices, the weights, quality of the meat, the slaughtering practices, and the assignment of stalls along the shambles. The guild has its own ordinances, its own livery, its own coat of arms, its own seal, its own parish church. The crucifixion play of the Butchers is, as we heard the audience discussing back on Micklegate, one of the most striking of the entire cycle. The connection between the trade of butchery and the central act of Christ's passion is one that medieval audiences understood, without needing it explained. The butcher's daily work of slaughter, the practical handling of flesh and blood, was the trade most directly suited to representing the violence of the crucifixion in dramatic form. The play, performed by butchers in butchers' aprons, presented the act of crucifixion in the working idiom of the men who knew most intimately of any tradesman in the city, what it actually looked like and felt like to take hold of a body and to do violence to it with iron tools. The theological logic was not lost on the medieval audience. The trade that handled the bodies of beasts in the city's market was the trade that would, in the dramatic logic of the cycle, handle the body of Christ at the centre of the Christian story. The pageant has been being performed in this form for the past 40 years by the butchers of the guild we are now walking past in their working street, and the men who wash down their stalls this evening with buckets of bloody water are the men who 4 hours ago played the 4 Roman soldiers who nailed Christ to the cross at the 12th and final station of the play route. Halfway down the shambles we pass a stall that has not yet quite finished its closing up. The butcher, a man in his early 40s, with the heavy build of his trade and the dark beard of the late 14th century English working class, is talking with a customer, a woman in the long blue wool gown of a merchant's wife, who has come in late for a particular cut she had asked him to set aside for her. He is wrapping it now in a piece of clean linen, weighing it on the brass scales at the back of his stall, naming the price. She pays him from a leather purse at her belt. She takes the parcel. She wishes him good night. He wishes her one in return. The exchange takes perhaps 2 minutes, in the unhurried way that the final transactions of a working day are conducted between people who know each other from 100 such previous exchanges, and there is in the small ordinary courtesy of it a glimpse of the social fabric of medieval urban life. The daily relationships between trade and customer, butcher and merchant's wife, conducted across years and across generations, in the shop in the same street, with the same brass scales and the same linen wrapping and the same evening exchange of good nights. We walk on. The shambles continues for perhaps 200 yards before opening at its northern end into the small market square called the Pavement, which is the principal open trading space of the city. The pavement is a roughly rectangular space, perhaps 100 yards by 60, paved with stone sets and ringed on all four sides by the merchant houses and the trade halls of the city. At its centre stands the market cross, a tall stone pillar with a small canopied head, dating from the late 13th century, around which the daily market of the city is conducted. The cross is also the place where civic proclamations are made, where royal commissioners read out their decrees, where the mayor's officers announce the city's news at the start of every market day, and where the condemned are sometimes pilloried in the public space of the market for the moral instruction of the citizens. The cross is the symbolic centre of York's civic life, in the way that every English market town has had its market cross as the centre of its civic life over the medieval centuries, and the citizens of York know this cross intimately, in the way that one knows the principal landmarks of one's own town. The pavement at this hour is largely empty. The market itself was suspended yesterday and today for the Corpus Christi festival. There is no trading in the city on the feast day by ancient ordinance of the council, and the market stalls that will be set up here tomorrow morning are still piled in their winter storage in the shed behind All Saints' Church. The space is occupied at this hour only by the dispersing festival crowd knots of 2 or 3 people sitting on the stone benches at the foot of the cross, talking in the late light. A group of children playing some game with a wooden ball that involves running over the open space and shouting. A pair of dogs sleeping in the corner under the arcade of the merchant house on the east side. The scant late traffic of foot passengers moving over the square on their way home from the festival. The light at this hour in late May is the long northern light of an early evening at almost latitude 54. The sun is still well above the western rooftops, and the limestone of the houses around the square is warm with the gold of the late afternoon, and the whole space has the soft luminous quality that a northern English city has at this hour of a long spring day, when the light has been falling on the streets for the past 15 hours, and the inhabitants have moved through it in the unhurried rhythm of a festival. We pause for a moment in the centre of the pavement, beside the cross. We look around at the merchant houses on the four sides. The grandest of them, on the eastern side, is the house of the Foss family, who have been one of the principal merchant dynasties of York for the past 3 generations, and who occupy at this date the front rank of the city's wealth. The house is 4 stories high, with elaborate carved timber along the jetties of the upper floors, and the painted shield of the family hanging from an iron bracket above the closed door. The Foss family deals in wool and in cloth, with extensive interests in the hull trade and in the staple at Calais, where the English wool merchants have, since the early 14th century, conducted the principal export trade of the kingdom. The current head of the family, John Foss, is in his 50s and has served twice as mayor of the city, and his house is one of the principal private buildings of York in this generation. Over the square from the Foss house, on the western side, is the Merchant Guild Hall, a stone building of the early 14th century, with a great hall on the upper floor where the Guild Merchant of York holds its meetings, and offices and stores on the ground floor for the administrative business of the Guild. The Guild Hall is the principal civic building of the city, alongside the smaller council chamber, where the city's mayor and aldermen sit, and it has been the home of the Merchant Guild, the dominant trade organisation of medieval York for the past 70 years. We walk on. We leave the pavement by its northeastern corner, following the line of Collier Gate up towards Stonegate and the Minster precinct. The streets here are narrower again, and they belong to the trades of the metal workers, the smiths, the cutlers, the spurriers, the lorimers, the makers of small iron goods, who have occupied this quarter of the city for several centuries, and who give the streets here their names. The smithy of one of the senior smiths is still working at this hour. We hear the steady ring of the hammer on iron coming through the open doorway, with the orange glow of the forge visible in the dark interior, and we pause for a moment outside, watching the smith and his apprentice at the late work on what looks like a horseshoe being shaped for a customer's mount that needs to be ready for an early morning departure tomorrow. The smith is bent over the anvil, with the iron held in his tongs, striking the steady measured blows that shape the bent metal into the curve of the shoe. The apprentice is at the bellows, working the long timber, handles up and down to keep the fire at the white heat that the smith requires. The work has the rhythm that smithy work has had since the Iron Age, the ring of the hammer, the breath of the bellows, the hiss of the quench when the shoe is plunged into the water tub to set the temper, and we listen for a moment to the sounds of a medieval forge at its evening work before we walk on. Stonegate, when we reach it, is the principal commercial street of the city, running from the pavement northwest toward the Minster, lined with the shops of the more substantial trades, with the houses of the wealthier shopkeepers above. The street has the slightly grander character of streets that lead toward cathedrals, in the way that English cathedral cities have always had a finer commercial street running up to their cathedral closes than they have anywhere else, because the trades that supply the cathedral chapter, the goldsmiths, who make the chalices and reliquaries, the glaziers who repair the windows, the parchment makers who supply the cathedral's writing offices, the spicers who provide the incense and the wax for the candles, the stationers who sell the prayer books and the writing materials, congregate in the streets nearest to the cathedral close and bring with them the slightly elevated character of trades that serve the wealthiest institution in the city. The shops on Stonegate at this hour are mostly shut, the day's trade over, with the painted signs of the trades hanging from their brackets in the still air. A silver chalice for the goldsmith, a quill pen for the stationer, a roll of parchment for the parchment maker, a glass bottle for the apothecary, a small painted statue for the imager who makes religious figures for parish churches and for private devotional use. We come up Stonegate toward the cathedral close. The minster rises ahead of us at the top of the street, framed at first by the leaning timber houses on either side, and then, as we approach the close, opening into the full prospect of the great west front, with its twin towers and its tall west window and the line of statues in their canopied niches over the porch. The west front of York Minster is one of the great architectural sites of 14th century England, completed in the present form perhaps 50 years before the date of our visit, and the visitor coming up Stonegate at any hour of any day in the late 14th century sees this view in much the form that the modern visitor sees it, with the limestone weathering over the centuries from the bright cream of the freshly quarried stone to the warmer grey gold of the weathered facade. The light at this hour is on the front of the cathedral directly, lighting the carved stone to the colour of honey, with the deep shadows of the porches and the niches cut sharp against the sunlit surfaces. We come to the gate of the cathedral close. The close is enclosed by its own wall, with its principal gate facing south towards Stonegate and toward the city. The gate is a substantial stone structure with iron hinges and timber doors, kept open during daylight hours and closed at curfew, with the close porter sitting on his stool in the gatehouse alongside, watching the foot traffic in and out and admitting only those with legitimate business in the close after the working day is over. He nods us through. He is an elderly man, perhaps 65, with the long grey beard and the heavy wool cloak of a minor officer of the cathedral chapter, and he has been the close porter at this gate for perhaps the past 20 years, knowing every regular face that passes through, and willing to direct the occasional stranger to whichever building they are seeking inside the close. We come through into the close itself. The space inside the wall is broader than one expects from outside it, perhaps 4 acres in total, with the cathedral occupying the eastern half and the buildings of the chapter occupying the western half. The Cathedral Close in York is one of the more spacious of English cathedral closes, and the buildings within it are arranged with the loose rural quality that a self-contained ecclesiastical precinct develops over the centuries. The Archbishop's Palace at the north end, with its own walled garden, the residences of the canons along the western side, each in its own small enclosed garden, the chapter house projecting from the north transept of the cathedral on its own paved precinct, the school of the songboys on the eastern side, the residences of the vicar's choral in their own enclosed terrace, the lay cemetery in the open space between the cathedral and the close wall to the south. The whole arrangement has the contemplative, ordered character that English cathedral closes have always had, in deliberate contrast to the dense commercial bustle of the secular city beyond the close walls. The bell of the cathedral has begun to ring for vespers as we come into the close. The vespers bell is one of the deeper bells of the great peal in the central tower, not the great bell that announces the principal services on the great festivals, but the working bell that calls the clergy of the cathedral to their daily offices. The bell is being rung by the cathedral bell ringer at his post in the bell chamber, in the steady rhythm that has called the chapter to vespers at this hour for the past 3 centuries. The sound carries over the close in the heavy resonant way that the great bells of medieval cathedrals carried, with the bronze of the bell producing the deep sustained note that is one of the principal acoustic facts of a medieval cathedral city. The clergy of the cathedral are responding to the bell. The vicar's choral are coming out of their residences on the east side of the close, in their black wool gowns and white surplices, moving in 2s and 3s over the close toward the south porch of the cathedral. The canons who are in residence this week are coming down from their houses on the western side, in their longer black gowns with the fur trim of their station and their black silk caps. The lay clerks, who sing the lower parts of the cathedral choir, are arriving from their lodgings outside the close. They are not in residence in the close itself, but are paid lay singers who come in for the daily offices and return home afterwards. The whole working community of the cathedral is converging on the south porch in the steady processional movement that the vespers bell calls forth at this hour every day of the year. We follow them. We come to the south porch of the cathedral, a deep stone porch, with a high vaulted ceiling and carved capitals on the columns, flanking the inner door. The door itself, an oak structure of the early 14th century studded with iron nails. The clergy are passing through ahead of us, exchanging brief greetings in the quiet voice that the threshold of a cathedral produces. We follow them through the porch and into the cathedral, the interior of York Minster, at this hour, in the long late light of a May evening, is one of the great spaces of medieval England. The visitor crossing the threshold from the porch into the nave finds himself in a vast vaulted hall, 300 feet long from west door to choir screen, 90 feet wide over the central nave and aisles, more than 100 feet high to the apex of the timber vault built in the elaborate decorated Gothic style of the early 14th century, with the slender clustered columns rising into the moulded arches and the high blind tracery of the triforium and the great clerestory windows above. The light coming through the windows at this hour is the gold of the western evening, slanting in low through the south aisle windows and lighting the limestone columns and the painted statues in their niches, and the painted screens of the side chapels in the warm reflected glow that medieval cathedrals had at this hour of a sunny day. The windows themselves, the stained glass of the nave, mostly the work of the early 14th century glaziers, are at their brightest at this hour, the late sun lighting the figures of the saints and the scenes from the Gospels in the deep blues and reds and yellows of medieval glass, casting coloured patches of light over the limestone floor of the nave. The nave is largely empty at this hour, The vespers service is held not in the nave itself, but in the choir behind the choir screen, and the lay people of the city, who would normally be in the nave for the morning and midday services, are mostly at their evening occupations at this hour and are not present for vespers in any numbers. There are perhaps a dozen people in the vast space of the nave, a few late pilgrims at the shrines along the side aisles, a few elderly citizens at private prayer in the chapels, a small group of country people who have come in for the festival and who are taking the opportunity to see the great cathedral from inside before they begin their journey home. And the space is therefore at one of its quieter daily moments, with the architecture and the light and the deep resonance of the bell still ringing in the upper space, combining to produce the contemplative atmosphere that medieval cathedrals were designed to produce. We walk slowly up the nave. The floor is paved with the local limestone, worn smooth over the central aisle by perhaps 150 years of foot traffic. The columns rise on either side of us in their clustered formation, with their carved capitals at the springing of the arches, showing the foliage and figurework of the early 14th century mason's craft. The side chapels along the aisles each contain their altars, their saintly images, their painted redoses, their racks of candles offered by the parishioners and pilgrims who have visited the cathedral. The smell of the nave is the smell that medieval cathedrals had, the deep, cool note of old limestone, the warm note of beeswax from the candles, the persistent note of frankincense from the censings at the daily masses, the faint sweetness of the dried flowers that the cathedral servants lay on the altars in spring, and underneath it, all the deeper smell of a great stone building that has been in continuous worship for the past 3 centuries and has absorbed into its fabric the accumulated atmosphere of all those years of devotion. We reach the choir screen, the great stone screen that separates the nave from the choir, with its row of carved kings standing in their canopied niches over the front. The screen is one of the principal sculptural works of the late 14th century in England, only partly complete at the date of our visit, but already showing in its finished sections the figures of 15 English kings from William the Conqueror through to the present Richard II, each in his crown and robes, each carrying the orb or the sceptre of his reign. The screen is being constructed by the cathedral masons in a program that began in the 1350s and will continue for another 50 years, with the figures added one at a time as the work permits. The figures already in place at the date of our visit run from the Conqueror through to Edward III, and the niche for Richard II is empty, awaiting the figure that will be carved for it in the next few years as the present king matures. We pass through the central door of the screen, a low stone arch in the centre of the structure, kept open for the daily passage between nave and choir, and we come into the choir. The choir is the working liturgical space of the cathedral, where the daily offices of the chapter are sung, where the high mass is celebrated on Sundays and feast days, where the formal life of the cathedral community is conducted over the long medieval day. The choir is being rebuilt in the new perpendicular Gothic style at this date, with the works at their middle stage, and the visitor in 1380 sees the new east end already complete in its final form, and the central bays still partly enclosed by the timber screens of the mason's workings, with the stone half cut and the scaffolding in place, and the working tools laid out on the wooden platforms where the masons will return in the morning. The space is therefore in part finished and in part raw, with the contrast between the completed perpendicular work to the east and the medieval Norman fabric of the central crossing, producing the layered effect that long-running cathedral construction projects always produce. The clergy who answered the vespers bell are taking their stalls. The choir of York Minster is arranged in the standard medieval pattern, with the carved oak stalls along the north and south sides of the choir, each stall reserved for a particular member of the cathedral community, the canons in their stalls along the upper tier, the vicar's choral in the lower tier, the lay clerks at the ends. The stalls are themselves works of the cathedral woodcarvers, completed in the middle decades of the 14th century, with the elaborate canopies above each seat and the carved misericords below the seats, showing the comic and scriptural and bestiary figures that medieval misericord carvers always favoured. The clergy enter the choir from the side, in the slow processional manner of the office, bow toward the high altar at the east end, and take their assigned places. The cantor, the senior vicar choral, whose responsibility it is to begin the chants, moves to his lectern at the head of the choir. The precentor, the cathedral officer, with overall responsibility for the music, takes his stall on the south side. The dean, who is the senior chapter officer present this week, takes the dean's stall on the south side near the screen. When all are in their places, there is a moment of silence. The cantor strikes the first note of the opening versicle, the call and response with which medieval vespers always began, and the response comes back from the assembled choir in the unison Gregorian chant that has been the principal music of the Latin office for the past 7 centuries. The chant is sung without instrumental accompaniment, in the unaccompanied vocal tradition that has been the standard of English cathedral worship since the introduction of the Benedictine rite 1,000 years ago. The voices of the men and the boys of the song school in the upper tier, the men of the vicar's choral and the lay clerks in the lower tier, fill the long stone choir with the resonance that medieval Gothic architecture was specifically designed to produce, with the sound bouncing off the limestone walls and the vaulted ceiling and the polished oak of the stalls, and producing the layered acoustic that gives the Gregorian chant its characteristic richness when heard in its proper architectural setting. The chant unfolds slowly over the next 40 minutes, in the steady measured pace of the medieval Latin office. The opening versicle and response, the first psalm with its antiphon, the second psalm with its antiphon, the third psalm, the short reading from Scripture, the office hymn, the Magnificat with its antiphon, the prayers, the closing versicle, the blessing. We stand at the back of the choir, near the screen, in the position where lay visitors to the cathedral were permitted to stand during the offices, close enough to hear the chant and to see the clergy in their stalls, but separate from the formal liturgical space at the eastern end. We listen. The Vespers of York Minster on the evening of Corpus Christi 1380 is a performance of medieval cathedral music in its proper architectural setting, at the proper hour by the trained voices of one of the principal cathedral establishments of the 14th century church, and the experience of hearing it is, for any visitor who has come to it from the secular world outside, the experience of being lifted briefly into the formal devotional life of the medieval church at one of its more impressive working moments. The voices rise, the light through the great east window, the temporary window of timber and glass that the chapter has put up while the new stone window is being prepared, turns deeper gold as the sun moves further west. The candles on the high altar are lit by the lay clerks at the appropriate point in the office. The censer is swung at the singing of the Magnificat, releasing the smoke of frankincense into the upper space of the choir. The smoke catching the late sunlight in its slow drift toward the timber ceiling. The whole production is one of the central acts of medieval cathedral life, conducted at this hour every day of the year in the steady rhythm of the office that has been the principal devotional pattern of European Christianity for the past 1,000 years. When Vespers ends, after the final blessing and the slow procession of the clergy out of their stalls and back toward the south porch and their residences in the close. We wait for a few minutes in the choir, letting the sound die away into the stone of the high vault. The candles on the high altar are extinguished. The lay clerks gather their music. The light in the choir shifts, becoming dimmer as the sun moves further toward the western horizon. We turn slowly back through the screen, back down the long nave. We pause, before we leave the cathedral, at the shrine of St. William of York, which stands behind the high altar at the eastern end of the choir, but is accessible from the nave through the side aisles. The shrine is the principal pilgrim destination of York Minster and one of the more visited shrines of northern England. William FitzHerbert, Archbishop of York from 1141 to 1147, and again briefly in 1153 before his death in the same year, was the saint to whom the cathedral was dedicated alongside its principal patron, Estepa, and his shrine has been the focus of pilgrim devotion at the cathedral for the past 200 years. The miracles attributed to his intercession, recorded in the cathedral's official miracle book, run into the hundreds over the centuries, with the great window of miracles in the north choir aisle. The great 15th-century window we know today was not yet installed in 1380, but its earlier predecessor in the same position was showing in stained glass the principal miracles of the saint for the instruction of the pilgrims who came to pray at the shrine. The shrine itself is an elaborate stone structure of the late 13th century, with the relics of the saint contained in a gilded reliquary on the upper part, accessible to the touch and the kiss of the pilgrims through an iron grille set into the side of the shrine, with the lower part of the structure carved with scenes from the saint's life and with the steady procession of pilgrim offerings, wax candles, silver coins, leaden ampoules of holy water, embroidered cloths, the occasional discarded crutch or bandage from a healed pilgrim laid around its base by the visitors of the day. We come up to the shrine in the late afternoon light. There are perhaps half a dozen pilgrims still at the shrine, having come for the festival and remained late after the principal queue of the day has dispersed. They are kneeling on the worn stone of the shrine floor, in their pilgrims' clothes with the scallop shells and the leaden badges of the various shrines they have visited pinned to their cloaks. An old woman is pressing her forehead to the iron grille and speaking softly to the saint in a low, continuous voice, in a prayer that she has perhaps been bringing to him across many years. A young man with a heavy bandage on his right arm is touching the grille with his good hand, in the wordless contact that medieval pilgrims made with the relics of the saints they petitioned. A middle-aged couple is laying a thin wax candle at the base of the shrine, lighting it from one of the steady tapers that the cathedral servants maintain for the pilgrims' use. The atmosphere of the shrine is hushed and intimate, different from the formal architectural grandeur of the choir we have just left, and we stand for a few minutes at a respectful distance, watching the medieval pilgrim devotion at its working hour, in the form it has taken at this shrine for the past 200 years, and that it will take here for another 150 before the Reformation suppresses the shrine and disperses the relics and ends the long pilgrim tradition of medieval York. The shrine of St. William is not, by the standards of medieval English pilgrim destinations, in the top rank. The first rank Canterbury for the shrine of Becket, Walsingham for the shrine of the Virgin, Glastonbury for the shrine of St. Joseph, draws the great national pilgrimages and the royal patronage and the international visitors who come to England specifically for the pilgrim trade. York's Shrine of St. William is in the second rank, a regional shrine of considerable importance for the north of England, drawing perhaps 15 or 20,000 pilgrims a year from the northern counties, but not on the international circuit and not on the royal route. The pilgrims who come to William are mostly Yorkshire pilgrims, with the occasional more distant visitor who is passing through the city for other reasons and who takes the opportunity to honour the local saint. The devotion to William is correspondingly a regional devotion, with its strongest hold on the parishes of the Diocese of York and its weakest hold beyond the northern province. But within the region, the saint is genuinely beloved, and the miracles attributed to his intercession in the cathedral's miracle book are reported with the steady confidence of a community that knows its saint well and that has built up over the generations a long-working relationship with his particular kind of help. We leave the shrine after a few minutes. We walk back down the south aisle of the nave, past the smaller chapels with their painted reberdoses and their saints in their niches, past the worn stone of the floor, where 2 centuries of pilgrim feet have made their slight depression in the centre of each aisle bay, back toward the south porch. We come out into the close. The close at this hour, after vespers has ended, is in the deep quiet that an enclosed cathedral precinct settles into at the close of its working day. The light is still on the upper stones of the cathedral, lighting the carved limestone of the central tower under its timber scaffolding, but the lower parts of the close are already in shadow. The clergy who have come out of vespers are dispersing back to their residences, in the small groups of 2 or 3 that gather after the office, and walk back together to their houses, talking about the day in low voices. The vicars choral, who do not eat their evening meal in the close but in their own residences on the eastern side, are heading there now. The canons in residence are walking back to their houses on the western side of the close, where their household servants will have prepared the canons' suppers for the small hour of 6:30. The lay clerks are leaving by the close gate to return to their lodgings outside. The whole working community of the cathedral is moving back into its private evening hours. We follow the lay clerks out through the close gate. The porter at the gate nods to us as we leave, as he nodded to us when we entered, and we are back in the secular city of York. The light outside the close has shifted in the time we have been in the cathedral. The sun is lower now, perhaps a hand's breadth above the western rooftops, with the gold of the late afternoon beginning to take on the deeper orange of evening proper. The streets are quieter than they were when we came up. Stonegate an hour ago. The festival crowd has dispersed further. Many of the country people have left the city by now to make their way home before dark. The pilgrims have settled into their lodgings. The local citizens are at their evening suppers. The shops are all shut. The trade signs hang still in the air. The smell of cooking from the kitchens behind the houses is stronger now, with the evening meals being prepared in every household of the city, and the rich composite of wood smoke and roasting meat and boiling vegetables and baking bread drifts through the streets in the still evening air. We turn left out of the closed gate, going down Pettergate toward the eastern part of the city. Pettergate is the principal east-west street of the upper city, running parallel to the long axis of the Minster, with the cathedral close on the south side and the dense merchant district on the north side. The street is narrower than Stonegate, but no less commercial, with the shops of the trades lining both sides, the parchment makers and the bookbinders and the craftsmen who serve the cathedral chapter, plus the trades of the wider city and the painted signs hanging from their iron brackets above the closed shop fronts. We walk down Pettergate for perhaps 200 yards. We come to the junction with Goodramgate, the long street that runs south from Pettergate down to the King's Square, at the centre of the city, and the pavement beyond it. We turn south down Goodramgate. The street here narrows considerably from Pettergate, with the timber houses leaning in over the cobbles on either side, and we walk through one of the older quarters of the city, the medieval working district that has been continuously inhabited since the Anglo-Scandinavian foundation of the city in the 9th and 10th centuries. The street is one of the principal commercial streets of the city in its everyday working life, but at this hour, with the day's trade over and the festival crowds dispersed, it has the close inhabited quality that medieval working streets had in their evening hours, with the upper stories lit from within by the candles and oil lamps of the household suppers, and the strip of evening sky narrow above the leaning jetties, and the warm, rich smells of the kitchens drifting down into the public space of the street. Halfway down Goodrham Gate, we pass Holy Trinity Church, a parish church set back from the street in its own enclosed, close hidden behind a row of merchant houses, accessible only through a narrow passage between two of the houses. The church itself is one of the loveliest of the smaller parish churches of York, a medieval building of the 12th and 13th centuries with later additions, set in a peaceful close among the dense urban fabric around it. The parishioners are coming out of the evening parish mass that has just ended. The parish priest of Holy Trinity holds an evening mass on the great feast days, separately from the cathedral vespers, for the parishioners who could not attend the morning service because of the play stations along the cycle route, and they are dispersing through the passage and back into Goodrham Gate in the loose movement of a parish congregation returning to its evening occupations. We pause at the entrance of the passage. We let the parishioners pass us on their way out. Then we go through the passage ourselves into the enclosed close behind. The close of Holy Trinity is a place that the visitor to medieval York remembers afterwards as one of the surprises of the city. From Goodrham Gate it is invisible. Only the passage between the two merchant houses, with the painted sign above it indicating the parish church beyond, marks its existence to the passer-by. But the close itself, when one comes through the passage, opens unexpectedly into a self-contained green space within the dense fabric of the urban street pattern. The parish church stands at the centre, a small structure of mixed dates. Norman foundations, 13th century nave, 14th century chancel, with a low timber-shingled bell tower at the west end. The churchyard around it is grassed, with a few yew trees of considerable age standing in the corners, and the gravestones of the parish dead set in their irregular rows over the open ground. The whole space is surrounded on three sides by the backs of the merchant houses on Goodrham Gate, with the timber-framed rear walls and the small windows of the upper stories looking down into the close, and on the fourth side by a low stone wall separating the churchyard from a small garden belonging to one of the adjoining houses. The light at this hour falls over the close from the western opening of the passage, lighting the front of the church in the warm gold of the evening and leaving the corners of the yard in deeper shadow. We come up to the door of the church. The parish priest is standing at the porch, in his cassock with his stole around his neck, exchanging brief words with the last of his parishioners as they leave. He is a man of perhaps 45, with the slightly weathered look of a working parish priest who has been at his cure for many years and who knows every one of his parishioners by name. The parishioners coming out are the working population of the parish, the small merchants and tradesmen of Upper Goodrham Gate, their wives, their apprentices, the elderly widows who have lived in the parish for 50 years, the young couples with their young children, the few elderly men leaning on their sticks. Each is greeted by the priest with a personal word, an inquiry after a sick wife, a remark about a son who has gone to apprenticeship in London, a question about the journey home of a daughter married into a Yorkshire farm, in the steady pastoral attention that a medieval parish priest gave to his parishioners over the long working years of his cure. We go inside the church. The interior is small by cathedral standards, perhaps 100 feet long from west door to high altar, perhaps 30 feet wide, but it is a fully equipped medieval parish church with all the features of its kind. The nave has its rows of timber benches for the parishioners. The pillars between the nave and the side aisles are squat Norman columns with carved capitals. The chancel is screened off from the nave by a painted timber screen of the early 14th century, with the figures of the saints painted on the panels and the rood. The great crucifix with the Virgin and St. John on either side mounted above the screen on its rood beam. The east window of the chancel is filled with stained glass of the early 14th century. The figures of the Virgin and St. John the Baptist and the parish's other saintly patrons in their panels. The candles on the high altar are still burning from the Mass that has just ended. The smell of the church is the smell of a working medieval parish church. At the close of its evening service, incense, beeswax, the warm smell of bodies that has filled the narrow space over the hour of the Mass, and underneath it, the deeper smell of a building that has been in continuous parish worship for the past 250 years. The parish clerk is at the altar, putting away the Mass vessels. A few of the late parishioners are still in the nave, kneeling at the benches in private prayer before they leave. An old woman is at the side altar of the Virgin, lighting a candle for some particular intention of her own. Two children are sitting on the floor at the foot of the rood screen, looking up at the painted figures with the absorbed attention that medieval children gave to the religious images of their parish churches. The whole space has the working domestic quality that medieval parish churches had, different from the architectural grandeur of the cathedral, more familiar, more bound up with the daily lives of the small community that worships in it, more like the working room of a household than like the formal hall of a great institution. We stand at the back of the nave for a few minutes. We watch the closing up of the church. The parish clerk extinguishes the altar candles one by one. The old woman at the Virgin's altar finishes her prayer and crosses herself and leaves. The two children are called by their mother, who has come back to fetch them, and they trot off after her toward the door. The priest comes back in from the porch, having seen the last of his parishioners on their way, and he goes through to the vestry to put away his stole and his cassock for the day. The church is, in another few minutes, empty. The parish clerk goes out through the side door, locking it behind him. The west door is still open. The church will remain open until complying in the practice of medieval parish churches for any parishioner who wants to come in for private prayer in the early evening, but the working life of the church has in effect closed for the day. We come out of the church, back through the close, back through the passage, back into Goodrham Gate. The street is quieter than it was when we entered the passage a few minutes ago. The dispersing congregation has gone on its way. The shop signs hang in the still air. The lit windows of the upper houses are beginning to appear as the householders light their first lamps for the evening. We walk on, with the small interlude of the parish church behind us, into the deeper twilight that is now settling over the upper city. We walk on. We come to the King's Square, the open trading space at the southern end of Goodrham Gate, where the streets of the upper city converge before continuing south to the pavement. The square is small, perhaps 50 yards across in any direction, and is the secondary marketplace of the city, occupied during the working week by the smaller traders who do not have stalls in the principal pavement market. The square is empty at this hour. The stalls are stacked at the corners. The space is occupied only by a few dogs and a knot of young men in working clothes, talking by the well in the centre. We turn west out of King Square down Low Petergate, the lower extension of Petergate, running west toward the river, and we come, in another 200 yards, to the meeting of Low Petergate with Stonegate at the narrow open space called the Stone Bow. The Stone Bow is a short stretch of broader street where the upper city converges before continuing south to the river. The light here is still strong on the upper stories of the houses, the western sun coming down the line of the street directly, and the street has the warm gold quality that the principal western-facing streets of York have at this hour of a long spring day. We turn south at the stone bow down Lendal toward the river. Lendal is one of the principal streets of the western quarter of the city, running down to the river at the water gate of Lendal Tower, where the wool wharves and the merchant warehouses occupy the bank of the Ouse for several hundred yards downstream from the bridge. The street is a working commercial street lined with the warehouses and counting houses of the wool merchants, and as we walk down it, we see the principal commercial fabric of medieval York at its most concentrated. The warehouses on Lendal are substantial stone buildings, 3 or 4 stories high, with broad arched doorways at ground level for the wagons that bring in the wool from the country, and that take out the bales for shipment down the river, and with smaller windowed counting rooms above, where the merchants and their clerks conduct the accounting work of the trade. The buildings are unornamented in their facades. These are working buildings, not residential ones, and the merchants who own them live in the merchant houses on Pavement and Coney Street rather than in their warehouses themselves. But they are built solidly and well in the local stone of the city, with the simple functional dignity that medieval commercial architecture had when it was not trying to be anything other than what it was. The wool wharves themselves run along the riverbank below the warehouses, with the great wool crane standing at the centre, a timber crane of the early 14th century, with its long boom and its rope and pulley system, operated by a team of 3 or 4 labourers from the Wool Merchants Guild. The crane is used for loading the wool bales onto the river barges that will take them down to Hull and onward to the continental ports. The bales themselves are stored in the warehouses over the year and brought out for shipment in the great loading weeks of the autumn and spring, with the crane working continuously across those weeks to move the bales from the warehouse doors to the barges at the wharves. At this hour, on Corpus Christi evening, the crane is at rest. No loading happens on the feast days, but the wharves are still busy with the activity of the merchants and their clerks finishing the accounting work of the day before the offices close. We pause at the corner where Lendal meets the riverbank, at the foot of the wool wharves. The Ouse here is at its broadest within the city, perhaps 80 yards across, and the river traffic of an ordinary day is at its busiest along this stretch. The river barges, with their flat bottoms and their square sails furled at this evening hour, are moored along the south bank, in a line of perhaps 15 vessels. The bargemen, the men who work the river trade, bringing in goods from the lower estuaries and the North Sea ports, are at their evening occupations on their barges, eating their suppers on the open decks, mending nets and ropes, making the small repairs that working vessels always require. The barges range in size from the smaller upper river craft that bring in goods from the towns above York to the larger sea-going barges that work the trade between York and Hull and that can take 100 wool bales in a single load. The wool merchants who own the warehouses are at the doors of their counting houses, finishing the day's work with their clerks. We see one of them, a man of perhaps 50, in the long wool gown and the fur-trimmed hood of the merchant class, standing in the doorway of a warehouse with a clerk beside him going over the entries in a long parchment ledger. The merchant is pointing at particular entries, asking questions, having the clerk amend the figures where necessary. The accounting of a wool merchant's business is the central administrative labour of his profession. The tracking of every bale received from the country, every bale stored in the warehouse, every bale shipped downriver, every payment made to the country producers, every payment received from the continental buyers, every customs duty paid at Hull, every commission paid to the various agents, and the daily and weekly and monthly accounts of the business produced the long ledgers in which the principal record of the medieval wool trade was kept. The clerks who maintained these ledgers were in their way the financial professionals of the medieval city, with the literacy in Latin and the numeracy in Roman numerals that the accounting required, and the clerks in the counting houses of Lendal at this evening hour are among the most highly trained working people in the city. We walk on. We come down to the river itself, at the small stone landing stage below the warehouses, where the smaller boats moor up to load and unload at the riverbank. The water at this point is brown and slow with the spring flow, but clear enough to see the riverbed in the shallows near the bank. A pair of swans are sitting at the edge of the water, dozing in the late light. A heron is standing on a small mud flat further downstream, watching the water with the still patient attention of herons. The river smells of itself, the brown freshwater smell of an English river in spring, mixed with the smells of the trade that works along its banks, the wet wool from the warehouses, and the tar from the barge mending, and the salt from the goods that have come up from Hull on the morning tide. We turn and walk back up Lendal toward the bridge. The light is shifting again. The sun is now perhaps a finger width above the western rooftops, and the gold of the late afternoon has become the deeper orange of evening proper, with the long shadows of the houses stretching far down the streets, and the upper stories catching the last direct light, and the lower stories already in the cool blue of evening shadow. The bells of the city's parish churches are ringing again now, the second evening bells of the day, marking the hour at which the working classes of the city eat their evening suppers, and at which the doors of the inns and the alehouses are opened for the evening trade. The city is moving into its evening hours. We come back up to the Ouse Bridge and cross over the river again, this time going from the north bank to the south. The bridge at this hour is busier than it was when we first crossed it earlier in the evening. The early evening trade of the bridge community is in full operation, with the minor craftsmen of the bridge at their last customers, and the foot traffic of the city moving back and forth over the river in the steady pulse of an inhabited place. We pause for a moment in the middle of the bridge at the chapel of St. William, where the cantor of the chapel has just begun to sing the evening anthem for the souls of the river dead, a daily devotion conducted at this hour for the past 100 years, with the chapel cantor singing a short Latin anthem to the Virgin in the space of the bridge chapel for the benefit of the souls of those who have drowned in the Ouse and for the protection of those crossing it tonight. We listen for a moment to the thin voice of the cantor coming out of the open door of the chapel. Then we walk on. On the south side of the bridge, we turn left up Skeldergate, the long street that runs east along the south bank of the river, behind the wool warehouses on the north side of Lendal that we have just visited, and through the working district, where the labourers of the wool trade and the bargemen and the lesser craftsmen who serve the river economy have their cottages and workshops. Skeldergate is a humbler street than the principal commercial streets we have walked through so far. The houses are smaller, mostly single-storey or two-storey timber-framed cottages, with the ground floor workshops opening directly onto the street and the family quarters in the small upper chambers. The trades here are the lower trades of the river economy: rope makers, net makers, basket weavers, sack makers, the small workshops that supply the wool trade with the working materials it requires, and the people in the street at this hour are the labouring population of the city at its evening work. We come, halfway down Skeldergate, to one of the principal taverns of the district, the Bull, which has been a tavern here since the early 14th century, and which is one of the well-known houses of the working districts of the South Bank. The Bull is a substantial building by the standards of the local street 3 stories high, with the painted sign of a black bull hanging from an iron bracket above the door, with the open archway leading through to the inner yard where the carts of country visitors are stabled. The ground floor of the building is the public room of the tavern, A long, low room with a beaten earth floor and a great open hearth at the inner wall, with the long oak tables and benches running the length of the room, and the doorway from the brewing kitchen at the back from which the ale jugs are brought in by the tavern wench over the long evenings of the trade. We go in. We push through the heavy oak door, half open at this hour, and we step into the warm, crowded interior of the medieval tavern at the early evening peak of its trade. The room is full. There are perhaps 40 people sitting at the tables, drinking the thin ale that the tavern brews in its back kitchen, eating the simple food that the tavern's cook produces at this hour, bread and cheese and slices of cold mutton from the morning's roast, served on wooden trenchers that the customers eat from with their hands. There is one large fire in the open hearth at the inner wall, with a great iron pot hanging over it, from which the cook is ladling stew into wooden bowls. The smoke from the fire rises slowly through the louvered opening in the ceiling above, which lets it out through a vent in the roof. The medieval tavern does not have a proper chimney, and the smoke fills the upper part of the room in a thin haze that gives the firelight its particular soft quality. The customers are the working population of the South Bank. There are bargemen in their working clothes, just come off the river barges moored at the wharves opposite the warehouses on the North Bank. There are wool workers, the porters who carry the bales between the warehouses and the wharves, the labourers who work the wool crane, the men who load and unload the carts that bring the wool into the city. There are small tradesmen from the workshops along Skeldergate, rope makers and net makers and sack makers in their leather aprons. There are a few country labourers who have come into the city for the festival and who have not yet begun their journey home, sitting at the corner table with their packs at their feet, drinking the ale that an unfamiliar city's good tavern provides at the end of a long day. And there are pilgrims, perhaps half a dozen pilgrims at the long table at the centre of the room, with the scallop shells and the leaden ampoules pinned to their cloaks, talking in the loud, excited way that pilgrims talk in taverns about the shrines they have visited and the miracles they have seen. The talk in the room is the talk of any medieval tavern on a festival evening, loud, multiple, overlapping, conducted in the broad Yorkshire English of the local population, with the occasional admixture of Lincolnshire and Lancashire and the further northern accents of the visiting country people, with snatches of French from the more educated members of the company, and the occasional fragment of Latin from the pilgrims quoting psalms. The principal topic is the play cycle that has just ended. The crucifixion play is, as it was on Micklegate, the play most discussed. The Last Judgment play, performed at the final station, is the other principal topic, the great closing pageant of the cycle, in which the Doomsday Court is set up, and the souls of the saved are separated from the souls of the damned, with Christ enthroned in glory at the centre, and the angels driving the damned into the mouth of hell on the lower wagon. The Last Judgment is the most theatrically ambitious of the pageants. It involves several wagons and perhaps 40 actors and considerable special effects, including a hell mouth that opens and closes and a representation of the saved souls rising to heaven. And the talk about it is the talk of a city whose population has spent the day watching this enormous communal piece of religious theatre, and who are now processing what they have seen in the way that an audience always processes what it has seen. We find a seat at the end of one of the long tables, in the corner near the door. The tavern wench, a young woman of perhaps 18, in a working dress of plain wool, with a white linen kerchief over her hair, comes to take our order. We ask for ale and bread and cheese. She nods, calls the order back to the brewer in the kitchen, and brings it across to us in a few minutes in the steady, efficient way that tavern wenches, who have been at the trade for some years, bring orders to occasional visitors. The ale, when it comes, is the small ale of the medieval tavern, a weak brown beer of perhaps 3% alcohol, brewed daily in the tavern's back kitchen from barley molten water, served in a leather jack rather than in the wooden mug of the country tavern, with the slight bitter taste of barley and the rich note of yeast that medieval ale always had. The bread is the dense wheat and rye loaf of the city baker, sliced thick and laid on a wooden trencher. The cheese is the local Yorkshire cheese, hard and sharp from the dairies of the surrounding country, cut in thick slabs. We sit and eat and drink, and we listen to the talk of the room. A man at the next table is telling a story to his companions about the actor who played the role of the devil in the Fall of Lucifer play at the second station this morning. The devil in the cycle is played by an apprentice of the guild whose pageant opens with the casting out of the fallen angels, by tradition the Smiths' Guild, who play the fall of Lucifer in connection with the smithy work of forging chains and the long association in medieval imagination between the smith and the underworld. The apprentice this year, by the man's account, is a young fellow of 17 named Robin, the son of one of the senior smiths of Stonegate, who has been training for the role of the devil for the past 2 years under the master of pageants of the guild. Robin, by the account, played the role this morning with a passion that exceeded any previous performance in the man's memory of the play. The devil's great speech at the moment of his fall, when he proclaims his pride against God and is cast down from heaven by the archangel Michael, was delivered in this account, with the controlled intensity that the role at its best requires, and the audience at the second station, which is the most demanding audience of the cycle, because the Platerit and Pompeieth and Surpass, responded with the appropriate murmur of approval at the curtain. The man is telling the story with the steady pride of an uncle or a neighbour reporting on a young man he knows well, and the companions at the table are listening with the engaged attention that is given to such stories in the corner of a tavern after a successful day of plays. At another table near the fire, a group of bargemen are arguing about the river trade. There has been talk in the city for the past several months that the customs duties on wool exports at Hull are to be raised in the coming year by the Royal Commissioners, a perennial topic of complaint in northern English commercial circles, with the wool merchants and the bargemen and the labourers who work the wool trade all united in their resentment of the customs administration of the King's officers. The bargemen are working through the implications of the rumoured rate change, with the senior man at the table, a grey-bearded barge-master of perhaps 60, explaining to the younger men in his crew what the previous rate changes have meant for the river trade in his experience, and what the likely consequences of the new rate will be for the coming season's earnings. The talk is technical and informed, in the way that working talk in medieval taverns was technical and informed, by men who knew their trade in detail, and who had no other forum in which to discuss its conditions than the long evening hours in their working tavern. At a third table, a smaller group is at a quieter conversation. 3 women, one of them with a child of perhaps 3 asleep on her lap, the other 2 with leather sacks at their feet that suggest they have come into the city for the festival and are still on their journey. The women are talking about the shrine of St. William in the Minster, about the queue they had to wait in this afternoon to make their offering at the shrine, about the small leaden ampoules of holy water that the cathedral chapter sells to pilgrims, about whether the relic of the saint that they had been able to see briefly through the iron grille is the same relic that one of the women remembers being shown to her on a previous visit 10 years ago. The talk is the talk of working women, whose connection to the cathedral is through the shrine devotion rather than through the daily offices, who have come to York to honour the saint on the feast that brings the largest crowds to the shrine each year, and who will leave the city tomorrow with their leaden ampoules and their satisfied sense of having made the pilgrimage they had set out to make. At a fourth table, against the side wall, an elderly man sits alone with a leather jack of ale in front of him, half finished, watching the room with the steady, unfocused gaze of someone who has come here every evening for so many years that he no longer particularly notices any individual face. He is perhaps 70. He is in the worn working clothes of a retired tradesman, a wool tunic that has been mended at the elbows, an old leather belt, a pair of wooden clogs on his feet under the bench. The tavern wench, when she passes him to bring fresh jugs to the bargeman's table, lays her hand briefly on his shoulder in the small gesture that is exchanged between two people who have known each other for many years, and he nods to her without looking up. He has been coming to the Bull, by the tavern wench's later account, when we ask her about him at the door, every evening for the past 40 years. He was a barge master on the Ouse himself, in his working years, one of the senior barge masters of the river trade in the middle decades of the century, and he retired 10 years ago when his hands became too stiff with the river damp to handle the tiller and the ropes any longer. His wife died 7 years ago. His two surviving sons have their own families in the parish of St. Mary Castlegate, and they look in on him every few days. He lives alone in the cottage by the river that he and his wife shared across their working years, and he comes to the Bull every evening between vespers and compline for a single jack of small ale, and he sits at this table against the wall, and he watches the room without expectation of much, in the steady evening company of the place that has been his second home for the past 4 decades. There is nothing tragic in him. There is no particular sorrow visible on his face. He has had, by the look of him, a working life of the ordinary medieval English kind, and his old age has the quiet dignity that the working old age of his class produced. The cottage, the surviving sons, the daily walk to the tavern, the single jack of ale, the seat against the wall, the slow watching of the room. He will go home soon. The tavern wench will say good night to him at the door. He will walk back to his cottage by the river bank with the slow, careful step of an old man in the failing light, and he will sit by his small fire for an hour with his thoughts before he goes to bed. We notice him without intrusion. We do not speak to him. We let him have his evening. We finish our ale. We pay the tavern wench. We rise. We push through the warm, crowded room toward the door. As we step out into the street, the cool of the evening hits us after the heat of the tavern interior, and the open sky above us is the deep blue of the late northern evening, with the first stars beginning to appear in the east, though the western sky is still gold with the last of the sunset. The bells of the city's churches are ringing again now, the compline bells of the parish churches, marking the close of the day's offices, and the great bell of the minster joining them with its deep, resonant note that carries over the whole of the urban space. We turn back along Skeldergate toward the bridge, and from the bridge back over the river to the north bank, and we walk now up Coney Street toward the centre of the city. Coney Street is the principal merchant street of York, a long broad street running from the Ouse Bridge up through the heart of the commercial district to the pavement at its eastern end, lined on both sides with the substantial houses of the wool merchants and the cloth merchants and the spicers and the goldsmiths and the other principal trades of the medieval city. The street has a slightly grander character than Micklegate, with the buildings on average a story higher and the painted signs of the trades larger and more elaborate, and the street is wider, with the central gutter running down the middle, and the cobbles worn smooth by perhaps 3 centuries of foot traffic. It is one of the principal commercial axes of the medieval English city, and walking down it at the close of an evening is a way of seeing the urban wealth of York at the most concentrated of its public displays. About halfway down Coney Street, we come to the Guildhall of the Merchant Adventurers of York, a substantial timber-framed building of the late 14th century, with its great hall on the upper floor and its undercroft on the ground level, used by the Guild for its commercial business and its charitable work. The Guildhall is one of the principal civic buildings of the city, alongside the smaller mayor's chamber where the city council meets, and it is the centre of the social and administrative life of the wool merchants, who dominate the commerce of York at this date. The Guild itself, formerly the Guild of Our Lord Jesus, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and St. John the Baptist of the Merchant Adventurers of the city of York, was founded in the early 14th century and has grown over the past 70 years into the principal trading guild of the city, with perhaps 200 members over the various branches of the export trade and an annual income from membership fees and trading fines and charitable bequests that places it among the wealthiest non-royal institutions of the north of England. We pause for a moment outside the Guildhall. The building is closed for the festival. No guild business is conducted on Corpus Christi Day, but the front door is open onto the street, and we can see, through the open door, the wagons of the merchants' pageant being returned to the storage area in the ground floor undercroft. The merchant adventurers play by ancient assignment in the cycle, the pageant of the marriage at Cana, the play of Christ's first miracle, when at his mother's request he turns the water in the jars at the wedding feast into wine. The play, which the merchants have played for the past 40 years, is one of the more elaborate pageants of the cycle, involving the construction of a wedding feast on the wagon, with a long table and benches, and a complement of perhaps 12 actors as the wedding guests, plus the actors playing Christ and the Virgin and the master of the feast, plus the working props of the water jars and the wine jugs, which the actors switch out at the critical moment to produce the visual effect of the miracle. The wagon for this pageant is being wheeled in now through the open door, with 4 porters of the guild manoeuvring it through the entrance, and we watch for a few minutes as they bring it through the threshold and down the slight slope into the undercroft, where it will be stored over the year until the next Corpus Christi brings it out again. The painted decoration of the wagon, the marriage feast scene painted on the side panels, the figures of the wedding guests in their 14th century English wedding clothes, despite the setting in Galilee, is visible as the wagon passes through the doorway, and we get a glimpse of the elaborate visual work that the guilds have put into their pageant wagons over the years. The master of pageants of the Merchants' Guild is standing in the doorway, watching the porters at their work. He is a man of perhaps 60, in the long wool gown of the guild's livery, a dark blue gown with white slashed sleeves and the embroidered badge of the guild at the breast. And he has been the master of pageants for the past 8 years, having been appointed by the guild council after the death of his predecessor in 1372. The role of Master of Pageants is one of the more demanding offices of a medieval craft guild. The master is responsible for the entire year-round preparation of the guild's contribution to the Corpus Christi cycle, the maintenance of the wagon, the management of the actors, the rehearsal of the play over the weeks of Lent and Easter, the coordination with the city corporation about the station assignments, the relations with the parish clergy who supervise the theological accuracy of the play texts, the management of the guild's annual budget for the production, the supervision of the costumes and the props and the music and the conduct of the actual procession on the day itself. The master in 1380 is also, as it happens, responsible for the slight modifications to the text of the play that the cathedral chapter has been requesting over the past 3 years. Small theological refinements that the dean has been asking the guild to incorporate in the steady process of revision that the cycle underwent over the centuries of its performance. The master at the doorway has, on his face, the slightly tired satisfaction of a man whose year of work has been brought to its successful conclusion at the end of this day, with the wagon coming back through the doorway and the play having been performed at all 12 stations to the satisfaction of the audiences and the cathedral chapter, and the year's labour being put away for the storage that will hold it until the cycle of preparation begins again at Christmas, with the appointment of the new actors and the reading of the parts. We watch the wagon being wheeled into the undercroft. The porters position it carefully along the back wall, in the space reserved for it among the other heavy guild equipment: the great cooking pot for the guild's annual feast, the trestles for the guild court, the stored timber benches for the various guild functions over the year. The painted scenery of the wagon is propped along the inner wall, where it will be stored alongside the wagon throughout the year. The props of the play, the water jars, the wine jugs, the tablecloth, the wedding garments of the actors, are being carried in by a younger member of the guild and laid out on the long table at the side of the undercroft for sorting and inventory. The whole operation has the steady, competent quality of a long-established annual ritual conducted by men who have done it many times before and who know exactly what each man's role is in the closing up of the guild's festival year. The master of pageants notices us at the doorway and inclines his head in the brief, courteous acknowledgement that a man of his station gives to evidently respectable visitors who have paused at the door. We incline our heads in return. We do not enter the guild hall. We are visitors to the city, not members of the guild, and the guild hall is the private space of its members. But we have, in the few minutes we have stood at the open door, been given the small privilege of glimpsing the end of the guild's festival year in the working space where the year is conducted. We walk on. Further down the street, we pause briefly outside the smaller guild hall of the Smiths' Company, a more modest timber building set back slightly from the street in its own small forecourt, where the wagon of the Smiths' pageant is also being returned. The Smiths' pageant is the Fall of Lucifer, the second pageant of the cycle, which is the play of the casting out of the rebel angels and the establishment of hell as a place of eternal punishment for the devils who fell. The wagon is a simpler structure than the merchant's wagon. The Smiths are a smaller and less wealthy guild, but it has its own elaborate features, including the hell-mouth machinery at the back of the wagon that opens and closes to swallow the falling devils at the climax of the play. The hell-mouth is being detached now from the wagon by the senior craftsmen of the guild, who will store it separately in their own workshop over the year, in the practice that has been maintained by the Smiths Guild for the past 40 years. We see, standing at the door of the guild hall, a young man of perhaps 17 in working clothes, with the dark hair and the broad shoulders of a smith's apprentice, watching the dismantling of the hellmouth with the engaged attention of an actor who has just delivered a successful performance and who is now seeing his stage being put away. This, we realise, is Robin the Smith's apprentice, whose performance as the devil in the morning's pageant was the subject of the conversation we overheard at the second station hours ago. He is the son of one of the senior smiths of Stonegate. He played the role of Lucifer this morning at 4 in the morning at the first station and has played it over the day at the further stations, finishing with the 12th station around 3 this afternoon, and he is now at the closing up of the wagon at the end of his successful day. He looks tired, he looks satisfied, he looks like a young man who has done a hard piece of work and has been told by his master and by the senior members of the guild that he did it well, which is, for a boy of 17, at his first major performance in the cycle, one of the principal moments of a young guildsman's life. We watch him for a moment. We walk on down Coney Street. The merchant houses on either side are catching the last of the evening light on their upper stories. The shops are all shut. The painted signs of the trades hang still in the cooling air. There are people in the streets still, the late traffic of the evening hour, with the citizens of the city walking back from the taverns and from the houses of friends where they have spent the early evening, in twos and threes, in the unhurried way that an inhabited city walks home in the evening. We pass the small parish church of St. Martin Coney Street on our right, with the bell of the parish ringing for Compline. We pass the apothecary's shop, with the painted sign of the pestle and mortar above the closed door. We pass the goldsmith's shop, with the painted shield of his craft. We come, at the eastern end of Coney Street, back to the pavement at the commercial centre of the city. The pavement at this hour, the second time we have crossed it tonight, is different from how it was earlier. The light is much lower now. The sun is below the western rooftops, and the long blue of the northern evening twilight has begun. The market cross at the centre of the square is in deep shadow. The merchant houses around the four sides are lit from within by the first candles and oil lamps of the household evenings, pinpoints of yellow light visible through the leaded windows of the upper stories. There is a torch-bearer at the corner of the square, lighting the oil cresset that the city corporation maintains at the principal public spaces. A tall iron post with a small oil-burning lamp at its top, which provides the principal public lighting of the city through the dark hours. He lights it now with a long taper that he carries on a pole, and the cresset begins to burn with its steady yellow flame, casting a small pool of light onto the cobbles of the square. There are perhaps half a dozen of these cressets at the principal squares and street junctions of the city, and the torchbearer goes from one to another at this hour every evening of the year, lighting them in the steady sequence that the corporation has maintained for the past century. The torchbearer himself is a man of perhaps 40, in the working clothes of a city servant, with the lined face of a man who has been at the work for the past 15 years and who knows every cresset post of the city by name. He is paid 6 pence a week by the corporation for the lighting in summer and 9 pence a week in winter when the dark hours are longer. He has, in addition, the perquisite of the small ends of taper that he collects from the snuffing out of the cressets at dawn each morning, which he sells to the householders for use in their own evening lamps. The work is steady and respectable, and within the strength of a man no longer young, and he has done it through the changes in the city's mayoralties, and the changes in the cathedral's deanships, and the changes in the trades along the principal streets. And the city looks much the same to him at the end of every working day as it did at the beginning. He nods to us as he passes the cresset he has just lit. He moves on toward the next one at the corner of Coney Street. We watch him go, we cross the pavement, and we turn north up Colliergate in the direction of the Minster again. The streets here are quieter than they were earlier. The working population is at home now, at their suppers and their evening occupations, with the streets occupied only by the last late traffic of foot passengers moving between houses and the occasional pair of watchmen on their evening rounds. The watchmen are appearing now in the streets in their growing numbers, pairs of men in the leather jerkins and steel caps of the city watch, each carrying a long staff and a horn at his belt, walking the streets in the steady patrols that the corporation has maintained against the nighttime crimes of the city for the past 3 centuries. The watch is not a professional police force. There are no professional police forces in medieval England, but a citizen militia, with each ward of the city contributing a quota of watchmen from its residents in rotation over the year, and each watch officer carrying the legal authority to detain anyone found out after curfew without lawful business. The watchmen at this hour are at the early stage of their patrols, walking the streets in the long blue twilight that will, over the next hour, deepen into the dark of a medieval city at night. We turn left out of Colliergate into one of the narrow snickelways that the city has in such abundance. Hornpot Lane, perhaps, or one of the small medieval passageways that cut between the principal streets in the dense fabric of the upper city. The Snickleway is so narrow that two people cannot walk abreast, perhaps 3 feet wide, with the timber walls of the houses pressing in on either side, and the upper stories above almost meeting overhead. The light in the Snickleway is almost gone now, only the faint blue of the upper sky visible above, and the warmer glow of the candle-lit upper windows reflecting off the timber walls. The smell of the Snickleway is the smell that medieval Snickleways had confined, organic, with the rich notes of cooking from the kitchens that back onto the passage, the sharper note of the privies that empty into the small drains running along the walls, and the dry note of the timber of the buildings themselves. We walk slowly down the Snickleway, with our shoulders almost brushing the walls on either side, and we come out at its far end into Goodram Gate again, 100 yards south of where we entered the upper city earlier. The Snickleways are one of the principal characteristics of medieval York. The city, having grown organically across many centuries on its constricted ridgetop site, has developed a dense network of narrow passages between its principal streets, mostly the result of subdivisions of the original building plots over the medieval centuries. When a single substantial plot has been divided into two, the access between the two halves of the divided property becomes a Snickleway, and when those Snickleways have connected at their ends to other Snickleways formed by other subdivisions, the network of narrow back passages has formed that constitutes one of the principal urban features of the medieval city. The Snickleways are not on any official map. They are not maintained by the city corporation. They are, in their legal status, the residue of private rights of way that have hardened over the centuries into the public network they now constitute. They are used by the working population for the small daily journeys between houses, by tradesmen for the deliveries that the principal streets are too crowded for, by children for the games they play in the relative privacy of the back ways, and by lovers for the meetings they conduct in the relative privacy of the same. The Snickleways are the small intimate spaces of the medieval city, in counterpoint to the broad public spaces of the principal streets, and they are one of the things that gives York its characteristic atmosphere of layered, dense human habitation. We turn south down Goodram Gate, back toward the centre. The bells of the parish churches are all ringing now for Compline, the last office of the medieval day, sung in the parish churches at this hour to mark the close of the working day and the beginning of the nighttime hours of rest. The bells from 40 parish churches over the city are ringing in their staggered timing, with the deep note of the minster bell holding the centre of the chorus and the smaller bells of the parishes ringing in counterpoint above and around it. The acoustic effect for the listener in the streets of the city at this hour is one of the more striking sensory experiences of medieval English life. A city-wide chorus of bells, with their varied notes and their different tempos and their overlapping rhythms, filling the air of the city in the way that birdsong fills the air of a country woodland at dawn, with the cumulative effect of an acoustic blanket of devotion thrown over the whole urban space at the close of every day. We pause for a moment in Goodram Gate to listen to the bells. The sound is everywhere. It comes from all directions. It rises and falls in the staggered rhythms of the different parishes, with one bell falling silent as another begins, and the great minster bell sustaining its deep note through the smaller bells around it. The whole air of the city is occupied by the bells in a way that the modern listener, in a modern city, can hardly imagine. There is no equivalent acoustic experience in modern urban life, no comparable saturation of public sound with religious meaning. We listen until the last bell falls silent. We walk on. We come back up. Goodram Gate to Pettergate, and from Pettergate back to the close gate of the cathedral. The porter at the gate is still on his stool, lighting now the oil lamp that hangs over the gateway, and that he keeps burning through the night to mark the closed gate for any late visitor who may approach. He nods us through. We go back into the cathedral, the close at this hour. In the deepening blue of the late twilight, has the quiet contemplative atmosphere that an enclosed religious precinct has at the close of every day. The buildings around the close are lit from within by the lights of the canonries and the song school and the vicar's choral residences, with the warmer glow of candlelight visible through the lidded windows of the upper chambers. The cathedral itself is dark on the outside, no exterior lighting of the medieval cathedral, but the great west window glows faintly with the light from inside the nave, where the cathedral servants have lit the principal hanging lamps for the Compline office that is about to begin. The Compline bell of the minster, the deep working bell that has called the chapter to Compline at this hour every day for the past 3 centuries, begins to ring as we cross the close toward the south porch. The clergy of the cathedral are coming out of their residences again in the second movement of the day toward the cathedral interior. The vicar's choral are walking over the close from the eastern side. The canons in residence are coming down from the west. The lay clerks are arriving back at the close gate. The procession to Compline is shorter than the procession to Vespers. Compline is a shorter office than Vespers, and the personnel are mostly the same, but it has the same steady rhythm, with the clergy moving toward the south porch in their 2s and 3s, exchanging quiet greetings as they meet at the porch, passing in through the open door in the slow processional manner of the office. We follow them in. We come back through the porch, back into the great vaulted nave, back along the limestone floor to the choir screen, back through the central door of the screen, back into the choir. The clergy are taking their stalls again. The candles on the high altar have been relit, 3 candles on either side of the altar cross, burning with the steady yellow flame of the beeswax candles that the cathedral uses for the working offices. The hanging lamps along the choir, 3 lamps, suspended on long iron chains from the vaulted ceiling, are also burning, casting their pools of warmer light onto the choir stalls below. The rest of the cathedral is in deep shadow now, with the colour of the stained glass barely visible in the windows, and the limestone columns and the carved capitals only faintly lit by the lamps below and the residual blue of the late twilight from the upper clerestory windows. We stand again at the back of the choir, in the position where lay visitors stand during the offices. The cantor strikes the first note of the opening versicle. The response comes back from the choir. Compline begins. The Compline office of the medieval church is the shorter office that closes the canonical day. It consists of a short opening versicle, a confession, the 4 short psalms appointed for Compline through the coming night. The Nunc Dimittis, the canticle of Simeon, with its antiphon, the prayers, and the closing benediction. The whole office takes perhaps 20 minutes to perform against the 40 minutes of Vespers, and it has the more compressed and more meditative character that the smaller office of the closing day requires. The Compline Hymta Lucis ante terminum, before the ending of the light, is one of the most beloved hymns of the medieval Latin office. The text is ancient, attributed to St. Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century, and the melody is one of the older Gregorian chants of the breviary. The hymn asks God for protection through the coming night against the dangers and the temptations of the dark hours, a prayer that in the medieval imagination was understood with a specific seriousness that the modern listener may not quite share, since the medieval night was a real and present danger in a way that the artificially lit nights of the modern world are not. The chant is sung slowly in the unaccompanied vocal tradition of the cathedral choir, with the unison voices of the men and the boys filling the lit space of the choir with the deep resonance that the vaulted stone produces. And the hymn lasts perhaps 4 minutes from its opening note to its closing. Amen. We listen. The chant rises into the stone vaulting above. The candles on the altar burn steadily. The light of the lamps catches the carved oak of the stalls and the figures of the misericords below the seats. The voices of the clergy fill the space with the ancient melody. The whole experience is one of the central acts of medieval European religious life, the daily evening surrender of the day's labour into the protection of God for the coming night, and the cumulative effect of being present for it, in the proper space, at the proper hour, with the proper chant, is one of the closest approaches a modern listener can make to the contemplative core of medieval Christianity. When Compline ends after the closing benediction and the slow procession of the clergy out of their stalls and back through the screen toward the south porch, we wait again for a few minutes in the choir, letting the last echo of the chant die away into the stones. The candles on the altar are extinguished by the lay clerks at the end of the office, but the hanging lamps along the choir are left burning. They will burn through the night, in the medieval cathedral tradition of maintaining a continuous low light in the choir against the long dark hours between Compline and Matins. The cathedral is becoming, in its working liturgical life, the nighttime space that it becomes every night over the medieval year, quiet, lit only by the few hanging lamps and the perpetual lamp at the high altar. With the watchman of the cathedral chapter beginning his nightly patrol of the building to check the security of the doors and the safe condition of the lamps and the absence of any intruders in the great dark spaces of the nave and the side chapels. We come back out of the choir, back through the nave, back through the south porch, back into the close. The Compline procession of the clergy has dispersed by the time we come out. The canons have returned to their houses on the west side. The vicars choral have returned to their residences on the east. The lay clerks have left through the close gate, and the close is empty in the deep blue of the late twilight, with the lit windows of the canonries on either side providing the only visible signs of habitation. We cross the close. We come out through the close gate. We are back in the secular city. The streets are quieter now than they have been at any previous moment of our walk through the city. The Compline bells have all fallen silent. The torchbearer has lit all the oil cressets at the principal squares and junctions. The shops are all shut, the shutters down, the painted signs hanging still in the air. The houses are lit from within by the scattered lights of the household evenings, the candles and the oil lamps and the firelight from the kitchens. But the streets themselves are in the deep twilight that approaches the actual dark. The watchmen are now at their fullest deployment, with pairs of men in the leather jerkins and steel caps walking the principal streets and the junctions and the gates, calling out the hours at each major junction as they pass in the steady patrol that will continue over the dark hours until dawn. We walk down Pettergate again, back towards Stonegate, and down Stonegate toward the centre. The streets are empty enough now that our own footsteps on the cobbles can be heard, in counterpoint to the distant calls of the watchman and the occasional bark of a dog from one of the inner courtyards behind the houses. The light from the lit windows above casts pools of yellow onto the dark cobbles below. The smell of the city in the deep twilight is the smell of wood smoke from the cooling kitchens and the warm, sweet smell of beeswax from the candles burning in the upper windows and the deeper underlying smell of the inhabited stone of the buildings themselves. We walk down through this quiet city in the way that one walks through any inhabited place at the close of its day, in the unhurried slow pace that the late evening permits. We come down to the Stonebow, and from the Stonebow down Lendal toward the river, and we come to the city wall at the river end of Lendal, at the gate called Lendal Tower. The Lendal Tower is one of the principal towers of the city wall, a substantial stone structure at the point where the wall meets the river, with a defensive function in earlier centuries and a more commercial function in the present, since the great chain that closes the river to traffic at curfew is anchored at this tower and is raised and lowered by the men of the city watch who staff the tower over the year. We come up to the tower. The men on duty are at the rope that controls the chain 3 watchmen of the river ward in their working dress, standing at the windlass that raises and lowers the chain over the river. The chain itself stretches from the Lendal Tower on this bank, over the water, to the corresponding tower on the south bank, which is called the North Street Tower, or sometimes the Barker Tower, and which controls the southern end of the chain. The 2 towers between them close the river at curfew each night, with the chain raised between them to prevent any boat from passing in or out of the city after the city gates have been closed. The watchmen are about to raise the chain. The curfew hour at York in 1380 is at the close of Compline, which is to say now, and the chain is being lifted at this moment in the steady operation that the city corporation maintains year-round. We pause for a moment to watch. The senior watchman at the windlass gives the order. The 3 men begin to wind the chain up onto the great oak windlass at the head of the tower. The chain rises slowly from the river. First the link nearest the tower, then the further links, then the centre of the chain coming up out of the water, and at the moment the watchmen at the corresponding tower on the south bank are doing the work from their end. The chain comes up in the slow, steady arc of the operation, and after some 3 minutes, it is at its proper raised position, about 4 feet above the water, at its lowest point in the middle, which is the position at which it will remain until the morning. Watch lowers it again at first light. The river is closed. The other gates of the city are being closed at the same hour. We do not see this happen ourselves, because we are at the Lendal Tower, but we know it is happening in the way that any inhabitant of the city knows it is happening by the routine of the corporation, the practice that has been maintained at this hour every night for the past 3 centuries. At Micklegate Bar, the great oak doors of the south gate are being swung shut by the gateman, with the iron-bound timber meeting in the centre of the arch and the great wooden bar being lowered into its iron brackets over the inside of the doors. At Bootham Bar, the northwestern gate, the same operation is happening. At Monk Bar, the northeastern gate, the same. At Walngate Bar, the eastern gate, the same. The 4 principal gates of the city, plus the smaller postern gates at various points along the wall, are all being closed in the steady simultaneous operation that the city watch coordinates each evening, with the bell at each gatehouse being rung at the moment of closing to signal the completion of the curfew to the watch and to the city. We step away from the Lendal Tower and walk along the inside of the city wall, eastward along its northern stretch. The wall here is the principal northern defence of the city, a stone wall of some 12 to 15 feet in height, with a parapet walkway along its inner face on which the watchmen patrol, and the periodic interval towers at intervals of about 100 yards along its length. The wall in its present form is the work of the late 13th century, when the city corporation rebuilt the older Norman walls in the larger and more substantial form they still occupy at the date of our visit. The whole circuit of the walls is about 2 miles long, and the watch of an ordinary night maintains some 30 men along the wall, in addition to the patrols of the streets within the city, a substantial defensive force by medieval English urban standards, reflecting the importance of the city and the value of the goods stored within it. We come to the steps that lead up to the parapet walkway at one of the interval towers. The watchman at the tower are an old soldier in his 50s named John Skelton, by his fellows calling him, and a younger man of about 25, his apprentice in the trade of the watch. John Skelton is a veteran of the French wars of Edward III. He fought at Crecy in 1346 in the company of Sir Ralph Neville, returned home in 1348, and has been in various forms of military and civic employment in the north of England across the 34 years since. He is now in the City Watch of York as one of the senior watchmen of the River Ward, with the experience and the seasoning that long military service produces. He nods to us as we come up the steps. We nod back. We ask him if we may stand on the parapet for a few minutes. He tells us we may. The walls of York are open to any citizen of the city or any reputable visitor during the working day, and the watchmen at the towers are accustomed to receiving the occasional walker who wants to see the city from the wall in the evening hours. We step onto the parapet walkway. The walkway is paved with stone sets, perhaps 4 feet wide, with a low stone parapet on the outer side and a slight inner railing on the inner side. The view from the walkway at this hour in the late twilight is one of the principal sights of medieval York. We stand for a few minutes and look out. To our north, beyond the wall, the open ground outside the city stretches away into the dim country of the late evening. The great Benedictine Abbey of St. Mary lies in its enclosed precinct just beyond the wall to the northwest, with the Abbey church visible above the boundary wall as a dark mass against the slightly paler sky. The fields and orchards of the Abbey lands stretch away further to the north, with the clusters of cottages of the Abbey tenants visible as the scattered points of candlelight against the darkening ground. The road north from Bootham Bar runs out across the open country toward the small village of Clifton and beyond to the further north. The road has carried, in the daytime, the slow traffic of country produce coming into the city, and it is empty now in the late twilight, with only the occasional traveller's lantern visible far out across the fields as a late-coming party makes its way home in the dusk. To our south, looking back into the city, we see the dense urban fabric of York spread out below us. The great minster rises at the centre, with its central tower under its timber scaffolding lit faintly from above by the residual light of the western sky, and from below by the small lights of the close around its base. The smaller spires of the parish churches rise across the city, perhaps 15 of them visible from this position, each marked by the small light at the top of its tower, where the parish maintains a perpetual lamp through the night, in the medieval practice of marking the church to wayfarers. The streets between are mostly dark from above. Only the flickers of the oil cressets at the principal junctions and the faint glow of the lit windows of the upper stories are visible, but the geometry of the streets themselves can be traced out, in the way that one traces out the layout of an inhabited city from above by the pattern of its lights. The whole city, seen from the wall in the late twilight, is one of the impressive urban sights of 14th-century England, and we stand and look at it for a while. To our west, the last of the sunset light is on the horizon. A deep orange glow above the line of the western hills, with the first stars appearing in the higher sky above. The Ouse below us runs through the city in its dark, slow channel, with the chain across its surface at the foot of Lendal Tower just visible as a slight line of disturbance in the water. The barges at the wharves are dark now. The bargemen are mostly at their suppers or asleep on their decks, and the river traffic of the day has ceased entirely. The few lights along the riverbank are the small lamps that the warehouses maintain across the night, against the risk of theft. To our east, the city continues toward the eastern wall at Micklegate Bar, with the dense roofs of the inhabited streets spreading away in the gathering dark. The further parishes are visible as pinpricks of light. The night is settling in. We turn back from the parapet for a moment to speak with the old soldier at the tower door. We ask him how long he has been on the watch. He tells us, in the broad northern English of a Yorkshire labouring man, with the slight French inflection that the wars in France have left in the speech of every English veteran of his generation, that he has been a watchman at the Lendal Tower for 11 years. He came to the post in 1369, in the year after his return from the Second French campaign of Edward III. He had served at the siege of Limoges and at the engagement in the Limousin that the Black Prince had conducted in the autumn of 1370, and he had come home to England in the spring of 1371 with a wound in his left leg that had never quite healed properly and that prevented him from taking up the labouring work he had done before the wars. He had served in the garrison at Carlisle for a year on the Scottish marches, and then had come down to York, where his elder brother had a place in the river trade, and he had taken up the post at the Lendal Tower at his brother's recommendation, and had been here ever since. His brother died in 1374 of a fever that came through the river ward in the autumn of that year. His wife, he had married a York woman in 1372, the widow of a smaller smith of the Stonebow district, died in 1377 in childbirth, with the child also dying after 3 days. He has since then lived alone in a modest house in one of the Snickelways off Skeldergate, with a niece who comes in to do his cooking and his washing in exchange for a small annual sum, and he has continued at the post at the Lendal Tower in the steady way that men of his generation continued in their employments after the personal losses of their middle years. He tells us, when we ask him, that the city has changed across his 11 years on the wall. The wool trade is not what it was when he came back from the wars. The great wool merchants of his youth are mostly dead now, and the new generation of merchants is doing a different kind of trade with the continental ports, with more cloth and less raw wool. And the slow shift in the economic life of the city is visible to him from the wall in the changing pattern of the river traffic at the wharves below. The play cycle is as good now as it was when he first came, perhaps better, by his judgment, since the guilds have grown more confident in their performance over the years, and have invested more in their pageants and their actors, and he goes each year to the second station, which he considers the best station of the cycle, and he spends the day from first light to dusk, watching the pageants with the kind of pleasure that medieval people took in their annual festivals. The crucifixion play of the butchers is, in his judgment also, the masterpiece of the cycle. He has seen it 11 times now. He has seen the role of Christ played by 4 different actors across those years. He has his own opinions about which actor has been the best, and he gives them to us in the calm, informed voice of a connoisseur of the local theatre. He tells us, when we ask him about the watch, that the night watch is a quiet business most of the time. The city is well policed by medieval standards. The respectable population stays off the streets after curfew. The watchmen know each other from years of working the same patrols, and they know the regular troublemakers of the city by name, and the rare disturbances that do happen are handled with the quick competence that long experience produces. The principal hazards of the watchman's work are the cold of the winter nights, the wet of the autumn rains, and the boredom of the long quiet hours between curfew and dawn. Not, by his account, the violence that the modern listener might imagine. He says all of this without complaint. He has been at the trade for 11 years. He has another 8 or 10 years in him, perhaps, before the leg that the French wound left him with becomes too painful for the stairs of the tower. He will stay at the post until then. He will retire to his house in the Snickelway when he can no longer climb the stairs, and his niece will look after him. And he will sit in his doorway in the Snickelway in the warm afternoons and watch the working life of the lower city go by until his time comes. He says this with the steady acceptance of an old soldier who has seen worse ends than the one waiting for him, and who is not afraid of his. We thank him for the conversation. We turn back to the parapet for the last time. John Skelton, behind us at the tower door, calls out the hour. The watch tradition of York includes the audible calling of the hours by the watchman at each tower, in the system that has been maintained for the past 2 centuries. The senior watchman at each tower calls out the time at the end of each hour, in the formula that the watch has used for generations: 8 o'clock, and all is well, 9 o'clock, and all is well, and so on through the night until the morning watch begins at 4. John calls out 8 o'clock, and all is well, 8 o'clock, and all is well, in the deep carrying voice of an old soldier, and the call is taken up by the watchman at the next tower along the wall, and then by the next, and the call passes along the circuit of the walls in the slow chain that announces the hour to the whole city. We listen to the call passing. We listen to the silence that returns when the last echo has died away. We stand on the parapet for a few minutes longer. The light is going. The stars are coming out across the upper sky. The temperature is dropping with the loss of the sun. The air is becoming cooler with that distinct edge that May evenings have in northern England after the warmth of the day has gone. The smells of the city are different from the daytime smells, less of the trade and the market and the slaughter, more of the wood smoke from the cooling kitchens and the warm sweetness of the candle-lit upper rooms. The sounds of the city are different. The working sounds of the day have been replaced by the quieter sounds of the night, with the calls of the watchmen at their towers, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint sound of voices from the lit windows of the upper houses, the soft chime of a parish bell ringing the half-hour somewhere across the rooftops, the steady working sound of the river running through its channel below. We take the steps back down from the parapet. We nod to John Skelton as we pass him at the tower door. We re-enter the streets of the city. The city in the proper darkness of the late evening has the quality that medieval cities had in their night hours, and that no modern city ever quite has. The quality of inhabited place reduced to the glints of human light against the surrounding dark. The streets are dark, the houses are dark on the outside. The light comes only from the small candles and oil lamps of the upper rooms where the householders are still awake, and from the shallow pools of light cast by the oil cressets at the principal junctions, and from the small lanterns carried by the watchmen on their patrols. The dark between the points of light is darker than any modern dark. There is no general illumination of the streets, no spill light from larger sources. Only the absolute night of a pre-industrial city after curfew, with the strip of starlit sky overhead being the brightest source of light anywhere outside the lit windows of the inhabited houses. The streets are largely empty. The curfew of the city is not a strict legal curfew that forbids all movement after the appointed hour. It is a softer civic curfew that asks for legitimate business as the reason for being out after dark, and that the watchman will challenge anyone abroad without obvious reason. The respectable population of the city is at home or at the late inn, or at the cathedral close, or at the religious houses, and the streets at this hour belong to the watch. The occasional servant on a late errand, the few priests and friars on pastoral visits to the dying, and the occasional party of revellers staggering home from a longer evening in the alehouses than their wives would approve of. We walk slowly through the dark streets, taking our last circuit of the city before we leave it for the night. We come down Stonegate again, with the lit windows of the upper houses providing the small points of yellow light at intervals along the dark street. We come to the pavement at the centre, where the oil cresset at the corner of the square is burning with its steady yellow flame, and we cross the empty square in the dark, with the market cross at the centre invisible, until we are almost upon it. We come through the small streets of the metal trades, past the smithy where the forge has long since been banked for the night, and out onto Coney Street, with its merchant houses lit faintly in the upper rooms where the wool merchants are, at their late accounts or at conversation with their wives over the small fires of their private chambers. We come back to the Ouse Bridge. We cross it for the third time tonight. The bridge is empty at this hour. Only the lamp burning at the chapel of St. William, at the centre, with the cantor of the chapel having long since gone home, and the chapel locked for the night with its low lamp left burning in the medieval practice. We pause for a moment in the middle of the bridge. We look up the river. We look down the river. The river is empty. The chain is up. The city is closed for the night. We come off the bridge on the south side. We walk slowly back up Micklegate toward the gate by which we entered the city. The street is dark. The merchant houses on either side are mostly with their upper rooms lit, but the lower floors in the darkness of the late evening, and the cobbles under our feet are uneven in the absence of any general light. We walk by the small pools of light from the upper windows and the faint flickers of the oil cressets at the corners. We come up to the second station of the play cycle, the wider place in the street, where the audience had been gathered earlier in the evening. The benches have been taken away now. They were collected by the city corporation's labourers in the hour after the last performance, and the station is empty in the dark, with the stone marker on the wall of the corner house barely visible by the light of the nearest cresset. We pause for a moment at the empty station. 6 hours ago, the wagon of the Butchers' Guild was here, with the actor playing Christ on the cross, and the 4 butchers as the Roman soldiers, and the audience packed onto the benches around the wagon, and the central act of the Christian story being performed in this exact space. Now the space is empty. The wagon is back in the Butchers' Guild hall. The actors are at their suppers in their houses. The audience is dispersed. The station is what it is across the rest of the year. An unmarked widening of the street that any passer-by would not notice unless they knew the marker on the wall. But the station is also, in the imagined life of the city, the place where the central act of the Christian story was performed today. The medieval citizens of York understood, in a way that the modern listener may have to make some effort to understand, that the place where a sacred event has been represented becomes, by its representation, a place that participates in the event itself. That the second station of the play cycle, where the crucifixion was played this afternoon, is the place where, in the imaginative geography of the medieval city, Calvary has been brought into the streets of York and made present to its citizens for one day of the year. The whole play cycle is, in this sense, the annual translation of the events of the Christian story from the distant lands of the Bible into the working streets of the medieval city, with the wagons doing the work of bringing the holy places into the imaginative reach of the population that watches them. The empty station, in the dark of the late evening, is in some way still the site of the crucifixion, in the same way that the dark minster behind us is still the site of the daily Mass, and the church of St. William's Shrine is still the site of the saint's particular presence in the city. The sacred geography of the medieval city is built up, day by day, by the accumulated devotions of the population, and the second station of the cycle has been built up over 40 years of annual performances into one of the recognised sacred places of the imaginative life of York. We walk on. We come up to Micklegate Bar at the southern gate. The gate is closed, the great oak doors with their iron studding meeting in the centre of the arch. The heavy timber bar across the inside, the gatemen in their lodge alongside watching the inside of the closed gate against any disturbance. We are not going through the gate tonight. The gates are closed and will not open before dawn, but we have come up to the gate to take our last view of the city before we leave it. We turn at the foot of the gate. We look back up Micklegate into the city. The street stretches away from us in the long dark perspective of a medieval urban thoroughfare at night, with the small points of light from the upper windows and the small flickers of the oil cressets at the corners providing the only sources of visible light along the receding length. The minster at the far end is just visible against the slightly paler sky beyond it. The central tower under its scaffolding, a dark mass against the deep blue of the upper night. The parish churches along the way are marked by the small perpetual lamps at their towers. The whole city, seen from the foot of the gate at this hour, is a dark inhabited mass of timber and stone and tiled roof, with the scattered points of human light marking its inhabited spaces and the surrounding country dark beyond the line of the walls. We look. We listen. The sounds of the city at this hour are the night sounds of a medieval place. The watchmen calling the half hour from their towers along the walls, the distant bark of a dog from one of the inner courtyards, the faint sound of voices from a lit upper window somewhere up Micklegate, the soft sound of the river running through its channel beyond the wall, the occasional creak of timber from a settling house, the wind in the upper night, moving across the rooftops in the soft sighing rush that the wind makes among the tile roofs of medieval cities. We stand at the foot of the gate for several minutes and we let the city's evening settle around us. In a moment, we will leave. In a moment, we will turn away from the gate and walk back out of the imagined space of medieval York and return to the present in which our own bodies are. But before we go, let us take one final imagined sweep across the city we have walked through tonight. Picture the great minster at the centre of the city, dark on the outside, lit faintly within by the perpetual lamps that the chapter keeps burning across the night, with the watchman of the cathedral making his slow patrol through the nave and the choir and the side chapels. Picture the close of the cathedral around it, with the lit upper windows of the canonries and the song school and the vicar's choral residences. Picture the dense streets of the upper city, Petergate, Stonegate, Goodramgate, Colliergate, with their leaning houses and their dark cobbles, and the small lit upper rooms where the householders are at their late occupations. Picture the pavement at the centre, with the oil cresset burning at the corner and the market cross dark at the centre. Picture the shambles, with the butchers asleep in the upper rooms above their closed stalls. The channel along the centre of the street still running with the residual water of the evening washing down. Picture Coney Street and the merchant houses, with the lit upper rooms of the great wool families and the candles burning at their evening accounts. Picture the Euse Bridge with the small lamp at the chapel of St. William, the chapel itself dark and locked, the cantor at home. Picture Lendal and the wool wharves, with the warehouses dark and the bargemen asleep on their decks. Picture the river itself, with the chain raised across its surface at the Lendal Tower, the water dark and slow in its channel through the dark city. Picture the south bank with the Bull Tavern, still showing the single light from its open shutters, where the last customers are still drinking the late ale of the evening. Picture the city walls running their long circuit of 2 miles around the whole, with the watchmen at their towers calling out the hours of the night. Picture the 4 great gates closed against the outside, with their iron-bound oak doors and their heavy timber bars and the gatemen in their lodges keeping the night watch. Picture the country beyond the walls, dark and quiet, with the scattered clusters of cottage lights at the outlying villages, and the Abbey of St. Mary lit faintly within its precinct to the northwest, and the gibbet on its mound outside Micklegate, dark against the night sky. Picture the stars above all of this. The late spring sky of northern England, with the constellations of the May night in their familiar positions, the pole star fixed to the north, the river of the Milky Way running across the upper sky in the way that it ran for the medieval observer, the same way it runs for us. Picture the whole urban world of medieval York spread out below the stars on this Thursday evening in May of the year 1380, with its 15,000 souls in their various conditions of evening rest, with its trades and its offices and its devotions all settled into the night, with its long medieval pattern of urban life continuing in the steady rhythm it has maintained for the past 3 centuries, and that it will maintain for another 150 before the Reformation begins. The long, slow transformation of the medieval city into the early modern city that will follow. This is the city we have walked through tonight. This is the city we are leaving now. We turn from the foot of Micklegate Bar. We walk back across the imagined space that we entered through this gate 6 hours ago in the late afternoon. We turn back into the present. The medieval city remains behind us. It will be there tomorrow, in its own ongoing time, with the dawn breaking over the eastern walls and the morning bell of the minster, calling the chapter to prime, and the gates being opened again at first light, and the working day of the city beginning again, as it has begun for the past 300 years. We will not be there to see it. Our evening with York 1380 has been a single evening, 5 or 6 hours of imagined presence in a place we cannot otherwise reach, and the evening is now done. What we have spent this evening with is one of the more impressive urban achievements of the medieval European world at the moment of its long late medieval maturity. York in 1380 is a city that has been continuously inhabited as a major urban centre since the Roman foundation in the year 71 of the Common Era. The Roman city, called Iberacum, was the principal northern military headquarters of the Roman occupation of Britain, with its legionary fortress occupying the same ground on the ridge above the Ouse, where the medieval minster now stands. The Anglo-Saxon city, called Eoforwic, was the principal northern city of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the 7th and 8th centuries, with its Anglo-Saxon minster on the same site and its commercial district along the Ouse below it. The Viking city, called Jorvik, was the capital of the Viking kingdom of Northumbria in the late 9th and 10th centuries, with its substantial trading economy and its dense urban population and its archaeological deposits that we are still excavating in the 21st century with the slow accumulating respect that the substantial Viking layer of York demands. The Norman city, after the conquest of 1066, was rebuilt under William the Conqueror and his successors with the new Norman cathedral and the new Norman castle and the new Norman walls and the new pattern of urban governance that brought it into the wider system of the Anglo-Norman state. The medieval city of 1380, which we have walked through tonight, is therefore the latest layer of a 1300-year continuous urban occupation, with each previous layer still present in some form beneath the present streets. The Roman walls under parts of the present walls, the Anglo-Saxon foundations under parts of the present minster, the Viking timber buildings under parts of the present commercial district, the Norman fabric under parts of the present civic architecture, and the city we have walked through has been built up, layer upon layer, by the accumulated labour of every generation that has inhabited it across the centuries. The city has been, across all of this time, a place of devotion. The Roman legionaries worked at their fortress, the Anglo-Saxon traders worked at their wharves, the Viking craftsmen worked at their workshops, the Norman masons worked at their cathedral, the medieval butchers and bakers and brewers and weavers and dyers and merchants and clerics worked at their trades. And the city has been, equally across all of this time, a place of devotion. The Roman pagan temples gave way to the Anglo-Saxon Christian minster, which gave way to the Norman cathedral, which gave way to the high Gothic cathedral we visited tonight, with the steady succession of religious buildings and religious communities and religious observances that has marked the city's spiritual life across the centuries. The integration of work and devotion that we have seen across the streets tonight, the Butchers' Guild playing the Crucifixion, the Merchants' Guild playing the Cana Wedding, the Cathedral chapter singing its daily offices alongside the daily commercial life of the city, the parish churches at the centre of every working district, the bells calling the city to its devotions from 40 separate towers, is the integration that medieval European urban life produced at its most thoroughly worked out, with the sacred and the secular interwoven at every level of the urban fabric in a way that the modern world has. Since the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution and the secularization of the public space, almost entirely lost. The medieval city is gone. The medieval city we have walked through tonight has not survived into the modern world in its medieval form. The Reformation of the 1530s and 1540s will dissolve the religious houses, suppress the mystery plays, redirect the parish churches into the new Protestant pattern, and break the integration of sacred and secular that we have seen tonight. The civil wars of the 17th century will damage the walls and the gates. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries will transform the economy and the social fabric. The Victorian rebuilding of the cathedral after the fire of 1840 will replace parts of the medieval interior with the Victorian Gothic restoration. The road widenings of the 19th and 20th centuries will destroy some of the medieval snickelways and demolish parts of the medieval street plan. The modern city of York is a recognizable descendant of the medieval city. The walls are still largely there. The minster still stands. Many of the parish churches survive. The shambles still runs in its narrow medieval line. The pavement is still the commercial centre, but the integrated medieval life that we have walked through tonight is not. It has been replaced by the secular urban life of the modern world, in which the cathedral is a tourist attraction more than a working centre. The parish churches are mostly closed except for occasional services. The trade guilds are historical societies in place of working economic institutions. The mystery plays are revived as a periodic cultural festival instead of performed as the annual devotional expression of the working population. And the bells of the parish churches are mostly silent, where once they rang in their citywide chorus at every canonical hour. What we have seen tonight in our 6 imagined hours in the city in 1380 is therefore not a vision of York as it now is, but a vision of York as it was at a particular moment 646 years in the past. In the full integrated medieval condition that the city occupied at that moment, and that it would not occupy for very many more generations. We have seen it in its working maturity. We have seen it on one of its great days. We have seen it at the close of that day, with the population going home, and the gates closing, and the watchman calling the hours, and the city settling into its medieval night. We have walked through it with the steady, unhurried attention that one brings to a place one is being given the rare privilege of visiting, and we have come, in the course of our walk, into a fuller acquaintance with the medieval city than the modern reader normally gets. Not the costume drama medieval city of popular imagination, with its knights and its tournaments and its courtly love, but the working medieval city as it actually was, with its butchers and its bargemen and its watchmen and its merchants and its clergy at the daily work of being a city. The city we have seen tonight is the city that its inhabitants made. It was made by them slowly, by hand, in stone and timber and brick and tile and iron and glass, across 13 centuries of continuous labour. It was made for their working lives, and for their devotional lives. It was made for their trades and for their festivals and for their parish lives and for their daily walks between home and shop and church and tavern and shrine. It was made by men and women whose names are mostly not recorded in the surviving documents. The butchers and bakers and weavers and dyers and labourers and servants who made up the bulk of its working population, and whose individual lives have left no trace in any archive, but whose collective labour produced the city we have walked through tonight. The city is the monument to those people. The walls and the minster and the parish churches and the shambles and the pavement and the snickelways are in some real sense the things that those people built with their hands across the centuries, and the city we have spent the evening in is the cumulative artifact of all those individual lives, of all those hands at all those daily labours, of all those generations of working medieval English men and women. When we leave the city now, when we turn away from the foot of Micklegate Bar and walk back out of the imagined space into the present where our bodies are, we leave it with the gratitude that an unexpected guest leaves the house of a generous host. The city has held us for 6 hours. The city has shown us its working life, its devotional life, its festival life, its evening life, its nighttime silence. The city has not been impressed by us, has not noticed us, has not changed for our presence. We have been visitors of the lightest possible footprint, walking through the streets at the close of an ordinary day in the slow, unobtrusive way that a sleep narration permits. But the city has been there, in its full inhabited reality, for our visit. And the visit has been the gift that being shown a real place at a real hour has always been to the visitor with eyes to see it. There is perhaps a small lesson in the seeing. The medieval city was not better than the modern world. The modern world is not worse than the medieval city. The two are different forms of human life, organized differently and with different strengths and different weaknesses, and the medieval city had its share of poverty and disease and injustice and limitation, just as the modern world has its own. But the medieval city had something that the modern world has lost, and that the modern world might, on quiet evenings, wish it could have back. It had the integration of work and devotion, the close knitting together of the daily and the holy, the saturation of the public space with shared meaning, the steady audible markings of the hours by bells that were rung in every parish for everyone's benefit. It had a coherence that the modern world, with all its advantages, does not quite have any more. The price of that coherence was high. The medieval city was less free than the modern world, less open to dissent, less tolerant of difference, less generous to the outsider, and we should not be sentimental about what it cost the people who lived under it. But the coherence was real, the integration was real, the shared world was real. We have walked through it tonight, and we have seen what it looked like, and what it sounded like, and what it smelled like, and we are the richer for having seen it. That is the gift the evening has given us. That is what we are taking back with us into the present, as we leave the city behind us at the foot of the dark gate and turn away. Before we let the imagined streets fade, 2 small asks. Wherever you are listening from tonight, leave it in the comments below. Every place that comes in is one more dot on the imagined map of who has shared this evening with us. And it is a quiet pleasure on the morning after a long script to see the names of the towns and the counties and the countries from which the company has gathered. And if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. There are many more evenings like this one in the months ahead. Other medieval cities, other dark hours, other quiet walks through places that survive only as ruins and chronicles. And every subscriber helps the channel grow toward them. We are grateful you came to York with us tonight, We hope the evening gave you something worth carrying back into your own. The night air outside the gate is cool now. The stars are out across the upper sky. The watchmen are still calling the half hour from the towers above us. The bell of one of the parish churches has just rung somewhere across the rooftops. The lights in the upper windows of Micklegate are going out one by one as the inhabitants of the city take to their beds. The dark blue of the late northern sky is turning slowly toward the deeper dark of the proper night. The city of York in 1380 is settling into its long quiet hours before dawn. Let the imagined streets fade now. Let the imagined walls dissolve. Let the gate behind us close softly into the past. Let the city we have walked through go gently back into the long sleep of the centuries from which we briefly woke it. Sleep well. Good night.